Sarcasm alert. Sarcasm alert. Sarcasm alert. Sarcasm alert. Sarcasm alert. Sarcasm alert. Hello everyone. Yes, today is Admiral Kimmel, and I've titled this one A Failure of Leadership. Despite what this says behind me, it is the 24th. It is a Thursday. There are many good things which have happened on the 24th. It's a good day. But in this case, there is going to be a lot of sarcasm. A lot of sarcasm. Hello, Wayne Borian. Hello, Knight 6831. Hello, Dunrick Ironhammer. Hello, Rick Varsava. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Zazaski. Hello, GM. You'll dedicate an hour or two to 2 hours to HMS Nubian. There'll be a lot of time designated to HMS Nubian at some point. Not today. George Newman, hello. DG40, hello. John Shea, hello. Sage, hello. Knight 6831. And chat, does Kimmel deserve the blame for disaster at Pearl Harbor? Well, I'm going to be starting off by answering that question. In a break from my normal pattern, I'm going to actually... This is going to be less sort of the make your own mind up based on history and more the barely contained sarcastic rantings of a historian who finds the public perception that has been traditionally associated with the sport man is being crafted far too heavily by politicians and far too little by actual fact. Hello, Teneferka. Hello, Andrew Bend. Hello, Steve Richards. Hello, Sage. Bijan, you've been a member for 10 months. Cool. Hello. Oh, I see movement. Sarcasm alert. Oh, yeah. You're in for it. Yes. Hello, Tis Transport. Hello, Submarine History. Hello, Paul Beswick. Hello, Wesley Phillips. Hello, Vintage Car History. Can't watch the whole thing. Heading to Rhode Island. Good luck. That'll be fun. So, I would think that given the time of Admiral Kimmel's posting Admiral Pearl Harbor, that he would have been carefully chosen position. He would have been the best they had. Well, for starters, he wasn't the first choice. First choice was Nimitz, who turned the job down because he decided it was a poison chalice. And Kimmel basically learned Nimitz had turned it down and learned who was actually going to be taking the post if he didn't take it, and said, "Thank you very much, Nimitz. I'll go take the job because, frankly, I don't want him put in charge." So, yeah, that's how Kimmel ends up with the role. Kimmel is actually technically only a rear admiral. He has been brevet promoted, vice admiral, and brevet promoted admiral. He is technically quite young for his post. And he's made scapegoat not for the US Navy's failures, for the Chief Naval Officer's failures perhaps, but more for a president's failures, an entire cabinet's failures, and a whole system's failure. In fact, one of the interesting phrases which I have behind me, and I have to say I haven't used this book too much because it's a bit of an argument book, is that it sort of basically the entire country is to an extent at fault, which is problematic for people to take in. There are many commissions have been concluded into Pearl Harbor. It's a problematic time for the US. It's a touchstone of quite a great import, but also great emotion, all of which is understandable. And I do realize that I'm recording this while also applying for an EST into America, so it could be interesting. But leaving that to one side, this is definitely not America's shining light history. Joe Mac, I'll be heading more into infrastructure where will be something about training. There'll be something about training, there'll be something about infrastructure. There'll be a lot about intelligence dissemination, and there'll be a bit about history of Kimmel. Hi, Phil Williams. It's transformed. I'd say it's more that after Richardson is dismissed. Well, the number of officers who used the line, well, I presumed he was getting this intelligence as Richardson had got it when he was out there. Curiously enough, he wasn't put on the same intelligence dissemination as Richardson had been, which meant he didn't get the information Richardson had had. That was almost as if to try and keep him quieter. He still complained a lot and still kept going, we don't have enough resources. Actually, everyone, did the US Navy even pay attention to Royal Navy airstrike on Toronto the year earlier? Well, it actually had a naval officer do an entire report, and if you go and listen to the Beltran special on Taranto, there's an entire discussion of the fact that there was a report done on it by the US Navy. And that officer offered to fly to Hawaii. He wasn't allowed to. He actually ends up getting posted to Alaska because the US Navy doesn't like what he's saying. So no, it's not disseminated. So the US Navy has a report and it's not disseminated. Hello, Jack Ray. Hello, Sean Mack. Before we get into it too much, I'm going to start off by saying thank you very much for everyone who's donated to the Hyder trip. That's going to be very cool. And that was way more than I was expecting. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who does super chats. Thank you to everyone who does the whole Patron thing. And of course, this is a Patron. This is Patron 49. This was Varsava's question. Admiral Kimmel, what did he do as the US Pacific Fleet Commander to ready it for war? Now, I have tried to work out some of my sarcasm by doing a long patrol, already recording the long patrol for this. So the long patrol for this is coming out on Saturday, and it's all being recorded. Although, technically, I'm re-recording Friday's video, but we'll leave that to one side. That'll get recorded tomorrow. I'm going to start off, though, slightly differently than I do with the long patrol. With the long patrol, I'm very logical. I work through Kimmel's life, and I then get into the whole thing around Pearl Harbor. With the live, I'm going to start off with the words of a very interesting admiral. And there are 3 or 4 admirals in history whose autobiographies, whilst I will always treat with every autobiography with a pinch of salt, I always do. There are ones like Vian, etc., and Caspar John, who are just so self-deprecating in that they are warts and all biography, that I really do trust their assessments of other people and the situations they're in. Maybe not necessarily themselves, but of other people. Halsey is one of them. And this is from his autobiography. And I've got 2 slides from his autobiography. And I'm going to read them out in full. The Enterprise completed her overhaul in December, so I shifted my flag to her and sailed her back to Pearl early in January, while the Yorktown took a turn in the yard. Our next big assignment came on February the 1st, when, as part of the general shake-up of flag officers, my friend and classmate, Rear Admiral Adm Kimmel, was relieved of his command of the cruiser battle force and was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet with rank of Admiral. Yeah. They reach down and find a Rear Admiral because they don't trust any of the Vice Admirals to actually do the job. There was no doubt of his qualifications, but he was a comparatively junior officer, and his promotion to a post of such responsibility astonished him, as it did the rest of us. His splendid record goes and gets most of the credit, of course, but part I attribute to the impression he had made during Secretary Knox's visit to the fleet the summer before. Mr. Knox had had the word passed that he wished every flag officer to call on him, and each was informed that he'd be expected at a set time. The procedure was unusual, but sound. It gave us a chance to meet the Secretary of the Navy against their own background, and it gave him a chance to size us up individually. I'm convinced that when Adm Kimmel was paid his call, his personality made an indelibly favourable impression, to the extent that his name leaped to Mr. Knox's mind when it was to take time to pick a successor to Admiral Joe Richardson. I don't believe there was a flag officer in the Pacific who did not feel that Kimmel was an ideal man for the job. Unfortunately, even an ideal man can't do a job without proper tools, and Kimmel did not have them. The blame falls on the ostrich policy which the United States adopted after World War I. We refuse to recognize the existence of the predatory nations. Therefore, they do not exist. On the theory that sweetness and light would prevail and that we would not have no further need for the Navy, appropriations to maintain it were cut and cut again. Enlistments had to be restricted for want of crews. Ships were laid up. Few new ships were built. As our strength waned, the ambitions of the predators waxed. Provincially, President Roosevelt came into power in time to save our military establishment from complete collapse. He began to restore it at once, and although still seriously, almost fatally weak, when war broke out, he had managed to shore it up enough to survive the first assault. When I say weak, I have especially in mind the Pacific Fleet. I quote from Kimmel's testimony before Joint Committee of the investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack. The Pacific Fleet was inferior to the Japanese fleet in every category of fighting ship. Japan, at the outbreak of hostilities, had 9 aircraft carriers in commission. We had 3 in the Pacific, and those did not have their full quota of planes. Although the battleships of the fleet were all approximately the same age as the heavy ships of the Japanese Navy, our ships were particularly deficient in short-range anti-aircraft weapons. And so on. We realised that the disparity, but despite emphatic warnings from officers who had served in the Far East, notably from Admiral Harry E. Yarnall, many of us were inclined to underrate the Japs, chiefly their aviation. Let me confess here that I revised my opinion after December 7th. The Japanese naval officers who made that attack were good. Very good indeed. It is a bitter paradox that some of our worst deficiencies were caused by the program aimed to remedy them. When the Navy began to expand in 1940, trained men were needed as cadres for new organizations. Thousands were drawn from the Pacific Fleet and replaced by raw recruits. As Kimmel had stated, more than 50% of his officers were newly commissioned reserves, and there were times when 70% of the men aboard individual ships had never heard a gun fired. The fleet's most desperate shortage was patrol planes and their crews. Proper defense of an island requires an 800-mile, 360-degree search by patrol planes, supplemented by a scouting force of submarines and fast service vessels. Kimmel had neither sufficient planes nor an adequate scouting force. I'm not exaggerating when I say that he did not have enough planes to maintain complete coverage over a 60-degree arc. As for crews, his original shortage was increased by orders to transfer 12 trained crews to the mainland every month. This situation offered him 2 alternatives. He could work his available planes and crews to the point where few, if any, would soon be operative, or he could reduce his search and conserve them for the outbreak of war. Kimmel chose to reduce his search, and although this was one of the factors that enabled the Japs' sneak attack to succeed, any admiral worth his stars would have made the same choice. Now, I would ask the chat this one thing. Is Halsey the type of admiral who minces words, or the type of person who minces words? Is he the type of person who is going to just say things because he feels like saying them? No. If anything, and I'm not sure if Jeanette will agree with me on this, Halsey has a reputation for being blunt, for being to the point, and being aggressively forthright in how right he is. Yet, Halsey is leaping to the defense of Kimmel, and he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to leap into this defense, but he does. This is one has to assume that it was at least suggested the USN would have made any aware of any threat, but that was clearly not the case. And as he said, Kimmel can only work with what's given. USN just needed USN just needed to look at King's fleet problem solutions from the 1930s. That was certainly something which Kimmel was trying to do, but there was an issue. This is sometimes feel I should have given my money as patron, but I need a question worthy of thought. There are questions. Vision. America loves to celebrate our lowest historical moments. From surprise attacks to assassinations to space shuttles going boom. D-Day is really the exception. Other than that, it's remember blank. Tim Richards. If he knows the Japanese were coming and has the fleet in deep water, blood be off surely for the USA. Well, here's the really interesting thing, and I will put this out there for the chat to consider, and I'll be talking this towards the end. Nimitz had the view that if Kimmel had known the Japanese fleet were coming, he'd have gone to sea to try and engage them, which could have led to the entire fleet being sunk because the battleships had no way of catching the Japanese carriers. And if the ships are sunk in deep water, they're never recovered. Whereas if they're sunk in the harbour, they are able to be recovered and put back into service in a few months' time, many of them. Blunt, Halsey was the proverbial bull in a china shop. Wayne Borean. Hell no. No, and I don't have but a great opinion of Halsey. Vision. Halsey was very blunt on Toradora, some of the best lines in the film. Shumack. Halsey can quick to judgment, as we see in the South Pacific. Yeah. Scott doesn't have to jump to Kimmel's defense, but a lot of Kimmel's friends left in Halsey's command, who can make Halsey's command very difficult if they're upset. Remember, again, Halsey is actually friends with Kimmel himself, I'd say, to an extent, but also, this is in his book written post-war. And it carries on. All our plans accepted the possibility of such an attack, but most of us believed that Japan's first strike would be southwards against the Malay Peninsula, i.e. they thought they'd attack Britain first. We hoped so because this would give us warning. However, if Pearl was struck first, we believed it probably be by submarine, synchronized with sabotage. The Hawaiian Islands have a Japanese population of 155,000. Admiral Richardson, Kimmel's predecessor, had observed that our regular anchorage at Lahaina Roads and between Mau and Lanai were dangerously exposed to submarines, and had ordered it abandoned. With the fleet thus concentrated at Pearl Harbor, Kimmel reorganized it into 3 task forces and scheduled their operations so that, as a general rule, only one would be in port at a time. As further protection against espionage, he forbade the fleet's movements to be mentioned. Hitherto, we had been openly allowed to discuss them freely. By the fall of 1940, we had known that war with Japan was inevitable. By next spring, we knew it was impending. One of our first indications was received on April the 4th when we were ordered to ship to remove all inflammable or splinterable gear, not needed for fighting. Boats, cushions, wooden chests, canvas awnings, excess cordage paint. We rigged splinter shields for the crews of our AA guns. We installed degaussing cables to neutralize magnetic mines and listening gear to detect submarines. On Kimmel's insistence, we set up war training exercises of all types. The carrier air group staged gunnery, bombing, and torpedo runs almost daily and practiced night takeoffs and landings. We arranged for submarines to maneuver with the carriers so that our pilots could learn to spot them at different depths. We experimented with our radars to determine their resources and limits. For instance, the Enterprise's radar was excellent at reporting the distance of a plane, but not its altitude. We evolved a rough solution to the problem by sending an air squadron 100 miles from the ship, with orders to shuttle at each 1,000-foot level up to 20,000 feet. Tracking them, we found that they had disappeared from the screen at certain intervals, then reappeared. We plotted the curve, establishing the nulls, blind spots, and computed the altitudes. This information we gave to the Army as well as the fleet. In the course of the test, our screen once showed that our second division of planes, then some 50 miles away, were straggling out of position. The pilots were not yet aware of our radar's powers and mystified when we called them and told them to close up. Kimmel conferred frequently with his Task Force commanders. Vice Admiral Pye, commanding Task Force 1, myself, commanding Task Force 2, and Vice Admiral Wilson Brown, commanding Task Force 3. Every scrap of information that came to him, he passed along to us. And to Rear Admiral William L. Lacoon, Commander Base Force 1, and Rear Admiral Claude C. Block, Commandant of the 14th Naval District. I recall with special clarity a conference on the morning of November 27th, the day that the famous war warning arrived from Washington. Kimmel was always concerned about our picket line islands, Midway, Wake, Johnson, and Palmyra, which were as inadequately armed and manned as the fleet. He had sent them all the reinforcements he could spare and had requested Major General Charles F. B. Price of the Marines, who was making a tour of the area, to inspect and criticize their defenses. These included on Wake Island and Wake and Midway newly completed airfields, which the War and Navy departments had agreed to stock with Army pursuit planes to be delivered by the Enterprise. The conference was called to decide what types of planes to send, old ones or new ones. The officers presented were Lieutenant General Walter C. Scott, commanding the Hawaiian Department, Major General Frederick L. Martin, commanding Short's Air Force, Vice Admiral Brown, Rear Admiral Bellinger, Commander Air Force Scouting Force, myself, and members of Kimmel's staff. General Short stated that inasmuch as these planes would probably be the first to meet the enemy, we should use the best we had. I asked General Martin, isn't it a fact that your pursuit flyers are forbidden to venture more than 15 miles from shore? He nodded. That is true. Then I said, They are no good for our purpose. We need pilots who can navigate over water. We decided to take marine planes, 12 F4Fs. The conference broke up then, but I stayed with Kimmel the rest of the morning. Returned after lunch and remained until 6 discussing his project. The utmost secrecy was imperative. We wanted no Japanese agent in alliance to warn Tokyo that we were arming Wake and Midway planes. Indeed, except for the officers of the conference and the other members of Kimmel's staff whose duty to acquire the information, only 2 officers were told. Commodore Miles R. Browning, my chief of staff, and Major Paul A. Putnam, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 211, which had been selected for the assignment. In order to get his pilots into the Enterprise without arousing suspicion, Putnam told them they were going off for 2 days' experimental work. They landed aboard with overnight kits and the clothes they were wearing. The next time their heroic survivors returned to that longitude was after almost 4 years in the hellholes of Japanese prison camps. We fully expected that cruise would take us into the lion's mouth, and that at any moment an overt act would precipitate war. Before we shoved off, I asked Kimmel, "How far do you want me to go?" His reply was characteristic. "Gunner, use your common sense." I considered that as fine an order as a subordinate ever received. It was by no means an attempt to pass the buck. He was simply giving me full authority as the man on the spot to handle the situation as I saw it, and I knew that he would back me to the hilt. Hello, Thomas van der Velde. Now, the point is, that sounds like Kimmel's doing pretty much everything he should be doing, doesn't it? This is Halsey's account. Hi, Thomas. And Halsey is saying, yeah, Kimmel's doing what he's supposed to. He's got us training. He's doing everything he can to prepare us. He's got us doing all the experiments, all the testings we can. So far, what's come up is he's got limited aircraft and he's losing his trained crews. But that's it. He's trying his best. He is trying his best to get the things in place. And that's the important thing for Kimmel. That's the important thing. He's trying his best. So let's see where he starts from. Well, Admiral Adm Kimmel has quite a long career in the US Navy. In fact, honestly, he has quite a prestigious service. He is born in Kentucky, Henderson, Kentucky. Always good when you have the name Henderson some way connected with an admiral. It usually speaks good things of them. He is born to Sibby Lambert Kimmel, and Major Manning Marius Kimmel, who I will be talking about in a second. Kimmel had several nicknames during his career, including Kim, Hubby, and Mustafa, because apparently he looked like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. I think it also was probably something to do with the similarity of Kimmel and Kemal, but you know. He married a naval officer he married a naval family, so he married into the Kincaids, and he had 3 sons a long time alongside his naval career. He saw extensive service, and I'll be going through his service as we go on. But the point is, yes, he is a rear admiral when he is put in charge of the Pacific Fleet. He's been acting as a more senior admiral, but he's only commissioned as a rear admiral. He is acting as he's been brevet vice admiral and now brevet admiral. He is experienced. He's about as experienced as you can be and be in the post he is. He is good. He's not the type who graduates top of his class. I'm not going to claim that. But he's got very good references and very good experience the whole way through, and he has managed to consistently get up to quite one of the youngest in various positions going all the way through. He is considered a good officer, not just by officers, but by the sailors. He is known, there's a fair number of stories, which I can't verify, basically their individual accounts, of him being very kind to sailors, kind of like Vian and a few other officers who I talk about in the Royal Navy. And Nimitz, and to an extent Halsey, actually, thinking about it. There are some admirals who have reputations which basically go beyond them. I think one of the troubles with evaluating Kimmel is the fact that he is banished to ignominy. And it's kind of interesting to note that there are some admirals who, when they have a bad time in the US Navy, they get pulled back and then they get given another chance. Kimmel doesn't. It starts to feel more and more political as time goes on, the reason for that. Right then. I would also say my strong suspicion is he joins the Navy rather than the Army because of his father's legacy. He certainly has a love for the Navy. And he works hard with the Navy. Hello, Ankash. I don't know. Kimmel about to receive a lot of attention. I gotta admit, that's caught my attention. Losing planes and train airmen is a recipe for disaster. Well, that's one of the things he was having to deal with as Admiral. He was doing his best to train them up, and the trouble is, as soon as he got them trained, he was losing his better people. That's good. Halsey is saying he was doing only so much Kimmel could do to polish the submarine he was presented with, and he was doing everything he could to polish that submarine. Very true. They weren't using Buffaloes, they were using Wildcats, early generation F4Fs. John, good officer in peace, bad in war? No, I think he would have been good in war. He had served in war and had experience. I don't think he's a bad one in war at all. But he doesn't get the chance. And I would add his war experience, and we'll be talking about it more, includes World War I, the Mexican Revolution. He's part of the U.S. occupation of Veracruz. And he serves in a lot of... He does... As much action as the US Navy gets, Kimmel is never far away from it in his career in those periods. In his 38 years of service, he is, wherever there is action, Kimmel is usually not far away and usually involved in somehow. And often quite important. That's good. Someone has to carry the can for Pearl Harbor, and the death sailors in Washington sure as Hootenanny going to make sure it's not them. Yep. Sure, Mac. Halsey definitely knew how to make the others men feel these, but he does object to being called old. Well, yeah, so would you if you were Halsey. Now, there are bits which aren't going to get more conversation, I know, than anything in chat, but I'm going to go through them all as they're in the long patrol thing, but, I thought I'd do a bit of stuff with his family. This is Thomas Kincaid, who is the commander of 7th Fleet and is his brother-in-law. So, a very much interconnected naval family. There is Manning Kimmel, who is, of course, his father, who managed to serve at the Battle of Bull Run in the Union Army, and then joined the Confederate, resigned his commission, joined the Confederate Army, then went to Mexico because after they lost to be a civil engineer, came back, was a civil engineer in America, and that's basically his life. He's a very interesting person, Manning Kimmel. He's one of only 4 officers who served in both the Union and Confederate armies during the Civil War. He actually did fight and win a medal. I think, did he win a medal? He was distinguished. I think he was mentioned in dispatches or something similar to that for his service at the Battle of Bull Run on the side of the Union. And sadly enough, Kimmel's son, Marius Kimmel, was a submarine commander who died during World War II. He actually died probably about the same time as his father was in some of the meetings he was in one of the actual inquiries back in Washington. His son was being burnt alive by the Japanese because, as far as we understand it, Kimmel's submarine hits a mine. Some of their crew get away. They get picked up they try to get to the island, try to make contact with guerrillas so they can get to safety. They get caught by a Japanese patrol instead. The Japanese patrol took them back to their base. There was an air raid on the base. The Japanese, upset with the air raid, made the prisoners dig a hole and then had them all get into it, covered them in petrol, and lit them on fire. Yep. Sure, I think Nimitz might have tapped him for Watchtower if he could have, but of course he was still far too toxic by then. Yes, thanks to the hatchet job, which mainly a certain Secretary of the Navy did on him. So, let's be honest, Thomas C. Kincaid, pretty darn good Admiral. And again, a very ardent defender of Kimmel. Doesn't need to. Yes, he's his brother-in-law, but let's be honest, we don't always have the best relationships with our brother-in-law. And there are ways of we can all read it. There are ways of saying you could say he was done, he did not deserve his punishment. Is a way of saying, well, yeah, he was responsible, but they were owed his punishment, versus saying, as Kincaid says, he was wronged. You can phrase it differently. Kincaid and Halsey had communication issues at Laerty Gulf. Yep. Jack Ray, did the scapegoating of Kimmel harm the analysis of systematic failures of the US around Pearl Harbor? Pretty much, because Forrestal wanted everything to be blamed on Kimmel. So, as far as Forrestal was concerned, all the blame rested on 2 people, Kimmel and Short. And therefore, no one else was to blame, and therefore the US systems were fine. He graduated from the US Naval Academy in 1904. This is pretty much what it looked like then. There's the new cadets quarters and mess hall. That was around that period. He goes straight to battleships. He is a very capable officer, already considered a capable officer at this point, and that is why he's sent to battleships, because he's good at maths and he's good at gunnery. And interesting enough, he will go on the Great White Fleet. He will take part in the Great White Fleet aboard USS Georgia. Yes. The steampunk battleships before steampunk even existed. But again, you don't send your bad officers to vessels like USS Georgia. They need a lot of nursing to get them around and get them for the Great White Fleet working. These are going to be your critical ships. You have ships you can send worse officers. These are ships you send your better officers to. Scott, was Forrestal perchance being responsible for those systems being in place? No, but Forrestal's god, Roosevelt, was. Brosowski, hello. Now, aboard Georgia, he seems to have fallen in love in gunnery and torpedoes, and that will go throughout his career. Kimmel will dance between destroyers and battleships. Destroyers and battleships. He'll be noted, as his son was noted for, being an aggressive officer, but also being a very capable officer. He had a chance of getting himself into trouble, but getting himself out of it, and thinking things through. He was pretty darn good at this job. Now, he, of course, took part in the Great White Fleet, and he had a pretty cool itinerary. He was on it the whole way through. Not all officers did actually do the whole way through, but his division was the Virginia class, was the second division, and here's this Georgia was the division flagship. So he was on the ship with Rear Admiral William H. Emory and under the command of Captain Henry McCree. Names which would pop up later for his career as often supporting him. There's a few officers who seem to really do quite pick up on Kimmel and decide he's quite a good young officer. Again, the more I read of him, the more he strikes me as maybe not an Andrew Cunningham type. That's more what I associate with Nimitz. But, well, certainly a John Cunningham type. A fairly decent officer. Capable. A safe pair of hands sort of thing. Someone who's not going to put many feet wrong and is going to put a lot more right. He did the full trip. He did the first leg, he did the second leg, he did the whole trip, he did on the Georgia. And the whole trip, the Georgia was the flagship. So he went the whole way around the world, which is a really cool thing. It's also a really important thing for his training. It means he has a lot of experience, which other officers at the time don't necessarily have, because a lot of officers take part in the Great White Fleet. Not as many as you'd think go the whole way round. So he has that experience from a junior officer. This announcement, which are the best ships to send battle officers to? Cruisers, battleships, or destroyers? Battleships which are staying close to home. Anything which has the phrase coastal defense or not going anywhere, i.e. a ship where you officers are basically providing just more bodies in terms of junior officers, and the ship isn't going to be doing much and they can't really muck much up. These days it's usually sadly enough, the amphibs who get the bad officers, but leave that one side. No, the amphibs usually get fairly decent officers, but if you're going to stick a less performing officer anywhere, they do seem to end up in the US Navy. Actually, no, the US Navy amphibs tend to get both the best and the worst. I'm not sure why. Perhaps they're averaging out. That's just from from meeting them and from what my own discussions with officers involved. I have no data or anything evidence to back that up. It's just what I've been told. I'm surprised that Congress, given the unrealistic expectation of what the HMS Nelson and the Rodney were going to be back in the 1920s. They had many views of what those ships would have been, that ships were going to be. That's good. Is that the ship with an 8-inch gun on top of the main 12-inch gun turrets? Yes, the Virginia class did have that particular honor. I still can't believe someone built this. I still can't. It's a case of how? Why? No, this is not a builder's trial photo of Georgia. Surprising enough, it isn't. It's we're crossing a great big ocean picture of Georgia, where the casemates have mysteriously had their guns managed to be pulled in somewhere, as I understand it. And Cash, was it the case that our best animals went on a battlecruiser tours in the interwar period too? A lot of our best would go for the UK. They would send a fairly large good crop of them. How do I put it so? With the RN in the 1920s and 30s, it was the better diplomatic officers, good commanding officers, but good fighting officers, but officers who were also very good at their diplomacy skill, were sent on those trips. Whereas the officers, let's say, like Vian, who were basically a case of holding him, I'm holding him. We have a war. Let him go. Ow! That could be a war crime. No, ow! That is a war crime. Hey, that was technically illegal. And you're not supposed to do that to Norway. Those were not sent on those tours. Vian never actually committed any war crime, as we classify it. He did break international law as a passing hobby, though. I should admit that. I will say that. Never a war crime. There's a few which are sort of possibly close, but not quite crossing that line. But, you know, so the Royal Navy has the sort of two group of officers. The officers who are good at fighting, but also good at diplomacy, and the officers who are we'll keep them in destroyers and keep them as far away from any diplomatic meeting as physically possible. He took part in the United States occupation of Veracruz next. He was there for the entire time they were there, and basically, it's kind of an interesting scenario because he's hopping between destroyers and battleships. He hops between destroyers and battleships. And he manages to serve on both involved in this. Senator Vian didn't commit war crimes because they never war crime the first time. That is probably true, actually, considering two of those events. Tim Richards, do you think that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time? I think Kimmel was. But I'd refer you to the earlier thing because Kimmel's doing the best he can to keep the task groups out. The battleships are one task group. They're in. Imagine if it had been a different time and there'd just been one of the carrier task groups in and the other battleships had been out. Or usually he's keeping both carrier task groups outside. So if you had a less officer who's more prepared to accept, the government's stringencies, etc., and be slightly more hidebound in terms of operations and not have this task force rotation sort of thing, the carriers could have been in Pearl Harbor. And if the carriers are in Pearl Harbor, then the war is over for the first 6 to 12 months. I.e., it's all she wrote. The Japanese have wiped out any chance of any American response. Add that Prince of Wales from Repulse, and you just have a nightmare. Oh, there's a Voxo. Nice again. Veracruz. Yes. Okay, so if I explain Veracruz, what happens? And it's one of those scenarios where the United States occupation of Veracruz is one of those just stories. But it does lead into the whole Germans promising the Mexicans a whole lot of resources in World War One to invade America. US Mexico relations had been strained by the Mexican American War, which had been sort of 1846 to 1848, following the annexation of Texas. And their relations never really improve that much. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson withdrew the US recognition from the government of Victoria Huerta and began to encouraging other great powers to follow suit. Now, Victoriano Huerta was, of course, the how do I put this? The person who had been actually appointed to an extent or installed, put in post by Wilson, because, well, the US ambassador in Mexico had previously managed to overthrow the successor of Porfirio Diaz with Francisco Madero with Huerta. Anyway, in October 1913, rebellions in the states of Chihuahua and Morelos, led by Pancho Villa and Emilio Zapata, broke out, and after Huerta declared basically victory in a blatantly fraudulent election. We like to think these things are new things the world gets up to. No, fraudulent elections, nothing new. So the US decided to supply Pancho Villa with munitions to try and defeat Huerta. Anyway, the Tampico affair is set off when 9 American sailors are arrested by the Mexican government for entering off-limits areas in Tampico, Tamaulipas. The unarmed sailors are arrested when they entered a fuel loading station. The sailors were released, but the US naval commander departed an apology and a 21-gun salute. The apology was provided, not the salute. You're going to guess what happens. So, Woodrow Wilson orders the US Navy to prepare to occupy the port of Veracruz because they haven't been rendered a 21-gun salute. Prior to getting authorization from the US Congress to carry out such a action, Wilson is told that there is a German merchant vessel arriving with a load of weapons for Mexico. As a result, Wilson issues an order to seize the port's customs office and confiscate the weaponry. Okay, yes, these are weapons belonging to one nation, being sold to another nation, existing in that other nation's port, and the Americans are going in to seize it. Here's the actual interesting fun. The weapons themselves had actually originally been sourced by an American and through a Russian arms dealer, not the German government. And some of the weapons actually originated from the Remington Arms Company in the United States of America. They were basically being shipped to Mexico via Odessa and Hamburg in order to avoid the American arms embargo. On morning of April 12th, 21st, 1914, Rear Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher arrives with the United States Atlantic Fleet and several ships of them, and basically starts seizing the Veracruz waterfront. They turn up with 7 battleships, 2 light cruisers, and 1 auxiliary cruiser. There is a battle, and Yeah, it's just the Americans lose 21 killed, 74 wounded, and 1 drowned. The Mexicans lose somewhere in the region of 330 killed, 250 wounded. And, well, they're in occupation from April 21st, 1914 to November the 23rd, 1914. So they're there for 7 months. Yeah, I know. America's being peaceful at this point. To quote a phrase, the Indian got his way to break any international laws, but he fractured a few rather badly. Interesting. Do you know how many carriers were planned before December 41 for the USA? Well, let's put it this way. They'd started to order the Essex Swarm. So, a lot. But they hadn't quite finalised any orders. So it's probably about... they're probably looking at it surging to 15 or so. Listen, Tampico affair, very accused occupation, were Wilson's first attempt to make the world safe for democracy. Yeah, I'm not sure it really works like that, but Wilson had some very interesting ideas. Tom Fanel, let's watch the most... Vision, Dreadnought USS Texas bombarded Tampico as part of a shakedown cruise. Also landed her Marines. Fun times. And let's give it Africanus. Just got on. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points includes territorial integrity and respect for small nations' sovereignty. In practice, only for European countries. That's my read. Yes. So, in 1915, Kimmel gets his first exposure really to politics. He serves as an aide to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, which means he's a name known by Roosevelt. They seem to build up quite a good working relationship, and Kimmel seems to be fairly proficient at dealing with the halls of politics, although he isn't there for that long a time. Mainly because Kimmel is recognized, even at this point, by the US Navy as not someone you want in the headquarters. He's someone you want on the front lines. Which is possibly a problem for Kimmel later on in life, because being the extra politics would have probably helped him. In anything, that might have helped him survive the Pearl Harbor thing. Having more the connections than just Roosevelt, who was prepared to burn him, protect himself. Just wonder what would have happened if the USA and Imperial Germany had gone to war over Mexico just before War I. The Royal Navy would have supplied the German Navy coal to go across to the other side of the Atlantic, and then forgotten to supply them any coal to get back. That is my actual take on it. Britain would have declared itself neutral in this dispute, and then made sure that the Germans had just enough coal to get themselves across the Atlantic. Then leave them there. It'd be a case of, oh, what do you say? The entire high seas fleet is the other side of the Atlantic. Oh, really? They don't have the coal to get back. Oh, good. Yes, for a short while in 1915, Kimmel was Roosevelt's aide. Which also is another reason to think that he's a fairly well-performing officer and a fairly good officer, because you don't really, again, send the officers who aren't quite clever and aren't able to think on their feet to go deal with politicians like Roosevelt. George Newman, in Syracuse, Admiral Frank Fletcher, Frank Friday Fletcher, had a junior staff officer named Frank Jack Fletcher, his nephew, who would be Admiral Fletcher at Coliseum Midway. Ah, yes. So much fun. So much nepotism. Roland Cash, aside from the President mission, part of the Great White Fleet's aim was to test long-range operations. Did similar missions occur later for submarines? Obviously, minus politically. Not really. You sometimes do, you do deployments between your own bases for submarines to test their operational range. You wouldn't do a international one. You didn't want to show people how long range your submarines were, not get them too close. Well, UK diplomacy was quite effective in the economic arena, but back to Roosevelt. Why didn't he help out Kimmel then during the fallout? Or was FDR being FDR again? Basically, Kimmel was being sacrificed to protect FDR. In the nicest way, I would argue what happens at Pearl Harbor is a testimony of people not checking that Kimmel's getting the intelligence he needs. There is one report which is quite interesting. Again, if we go in here, and I'll say that I'll use this. I'm going to use this book occasionally. So, the committee found that the intelligence and war plans divisions of both the Navy and the Army in Washington had failed to give careful and thoughtful consideration to the magic messages intercepted over 4 months. Notably, those showing that Japanese espionage had specifically targeted the warships at Pearl Harbor. The intercepts, or the gist of them, should have been supplied to Admiral Kimmel and General Short. Those who headed these divisions, Wilkinson, Turner, Miles, and Gerald, were blamed for inference. Blamed by inference, but not by name. Though both C&O Stark and Admiral Turner had said they thought Admiral Kimmel was getting magic, the committee's report noted pointedly neither had made sure to establish that for a fact. On the morning of the 7th, Stark had first hesitated to let the commanders know the Japanese plan to confront the Secretary of State precisely 1 p.m. Washington time, 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. Stark reasoned that he did not want to confuse them, and while he was not sensitive of this, the report made it clear that if there was any doubt, information should always be sent. I would add also, there's another point at which he goes, let's see. Marshall, who definitely doesn't deserve too much discredit for this, but Marshall himself points out, because there had been a story that Marshall takes the blame for no alert. The Chief of Staff took overall responsibility for the failure to make General Short to see that November 27th war warning was more than a sabotage alert. Interesting enough, Chief Naval Officer Stark, our Chief Naval Operations Stark, didn't, for doing the same with Kimmel. It was clear, however, that the man who had done so, much to win the war, felt harassed during his testimony and could not remember the details. Pressed on the point, Marshall snapped, "I had an immense amount of papers going over my desk every day. I'm not a bookkeeping machine." It's going to sound strange, but I think the more and more I read about Pearl Harbor, and the more and more I've read about this, I don't agree with Kimmel being made a scapegoat. But in many ways, Kimmel is being made a scapegoat for a system which has been chronically underfunded and chronically undeveloped for that time. They don't have the staff, the bureaucracy to manage these things. And one of the things you would expect to do is someone to have the responsibility for making sure that the appropriate people are getting the intelligence they need. And if it's a general officer or an admiral officer, that's great. But there should have been someone whose job it was to do it. And maybe it would be an admiral overseeing it, but they'd have a staff officer responsible for making sure it was happening. And that Admiral would check in with that staff officer. Because there is no reason that, okay, maybe they don't receive the full magic intercepts. Maybe those just go to the British again and the sources they do go to. But the point is, they should have received the assessments based on magic, which would have told Kimmel, there be stuff coming your way. Prepare for it. Because, honestly, Kimmel's taking enough, how do I put this, enough latitude already that he probably divided his battle squadron into 2 task force and make sure that he always has at least one of those 4 ship groups at sea. And then you'd have found him caught with just 4 ships caught in Pearl Harbor. And with that, they'd have had room to maneuver, so they might have actually some of them might have got out. Anyway, what was one of most Kimmel's important World War I job? Well, he's sent out with the Battleship Division 9, aka 6th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet, and his job is to make their gunnery the same level as the rest of the Royal Navy's. His initial reports are that it's abysmal and that he would... How do I put it? There is a tone in his reports that comes across like the officer on, I think it was Enterprise, who was ardently trying to fit more 20mm cannon. He was very upset when there was too little top weight to add more cannon. Well, Kimmel's very upset when he realizes there's only 24 hours in a day. He does get the gunnery. The gunnery of 6th Battle Squadron goes from being worse than the battle cruiser force ever was to being one of the best squadrons in the battle of the Grand Fleet. That is all down to Kimmel. That is, everything is credited to Kimmel. He dances from ship to ship to ship. He devises new targets. He gets everything going he can to get those ships firing as good as he can. He pretty much rebuilds the entire gunnery manual without changing it enough that it's going to upset the Bureau of Ordnance. He puts in theatre corrections. Does everything he can to make it work. That's good. Royal Navy to the German Navy. I'm presuming this is over the lack of coal turning up to get them back across the Atlantic. Oh my, how did the administrative oversight occur? Was it Jenkins again? Oh well. Cheese and port. Remember to give some Jenkins. Sorry, Mike. So much nepotism, says the Royal Navy historian. Yeah, if I say there's nepotism going on, it's bad. At least with the Royal Navy, they tended to send them off with, I don't know, their friends' family, their friends, not directly with family members. As a rule, they send them off to someone else. Nationality. For everyone else, Wilson is a bad president. For Poland, he's a good one. It was instrumental in our regaining independence, and his friend, the Colonel, has a monument in Poland for his work to help the Polish people. Colonel Edward Mandel House. That's good, because Colonel House was one of the better people in Wilson's presidency. I can't help but wonder if Kimmel was at the Washington Naval Treaty instead of Secretary of State, how he'd have handled the British Sea Lord at the time. I think he was busy in those times. George Newman. U.S. Army San Francisco thought the Japanese attack would hit the U.S. West Coast. Even a couple of idiot officers in Washington, D.C. thought the Japanese would hit D.C. There are always some. What book is Dr. Clarke using now? Okay, well, this is one of 6 books I've used. This particular book is A Matter of Honor. Pearl Harbor, Betrayal, Blame, and a Family's Quest for Justice, written by Anthony Summers and Robin Swan. Honestly, I'm always unsure about books which have on the title front page, their review by something like the Christian Science Monitor. Not that I have anything against a Christian Science Monitor, but it's a science book, not a history book. A science journal, not a history journal. And it says outstanding, but it's a fairly decent book. There are some bits of rhetorical integrity in there, but I suppose. Vision. Oh, look, the Americans streaming into say to besiege British like in Lord of the Rings. No, that was them coming back from one of their training exercises. Probably, in the nicest way, there were a lot of gunnery officers hoping that Kimmel was going to be very nice to them at this point. Georgian, speaking of nepotism, Admiral Graf Spain in World War II, and two of his sons were killed in the Battle of Falklands. Yep, and there's the Sullivans, which were 5 brothers on the same one ship. South, the Royal Navy allows High Seas Fleet to conduct repairs in Canada after the fight with the US, and issues all dock workers with cameras. No, it wouldn't be you. It wouldn't be Canada. No. Barbados. The RN used its nepotism to place idiot cousins in faraway areas where they can't get much problem. Usually worked out, but there are exceptions. Vision, who's to blame is still a hot topic of debate in articles, essays, and letters in USNI's proceedings in naval history. Oh, yes. So it's not really nepotism that the family officers join the same service and tend to try rather hard to meet expectations of their elders. Sometimes this is seen as nepotism when it's not. It's just commitment. It's interesting. Nice figuring. How good was Kimmel in the view of the Royal Navy as a whole? He was very respected. The gunnery officers in the other squadrons respected him. Post World War I, he gets a lovely post, Executive Officer of the USS Arkansas. Again, not a bad career, and he continues his habit of going battleships, destroyers, battleships, destroyers, battleships, destroyers. I'm a torpedo officer. I'm a gunnery officer. I'm a torpedo officer. I'm a gunnery officer. I'm really aggressive. I'm really aggressive in a small ship. I can dance around the enemy. I'm tremendously aggressive in a large ship that I can bash into the enemy. This is Kimmel's career. Grand Chelsea. Christian Science has nothing to do with science as you or I would answer it. It refers to Christian Science, the belief in the faith. We have a Christian Science Centre down the road. Ian Richards. Do you think RDF and the top branch knew the Japanese were on the way and let it happen? No. I think they had an inkling, but I honestly don't think they let it happen. I think it's that. This is going to sound strange. They all presumed it was someone else's job to tell people like Kimmel and Short what was going on. And the trouble is, no one was doing it. So Kimmel and Short weren't getting the same information they were getting. They were getting these war warnings. Lovely. But they weren't getting the information which would have given the war warnings context. They were being told, there's a war coming with Japan. At which point, Kimmel's probably looking down at his watch and going, yes, and tell me something I didn't know. There's a war coming with Japan. No, I mean literally, tell me something I don't know. Tell me where the information is coming from for this assessment. Tell me. And they're not passing it on. You know, the constant refrain, and this is what's interesting is MacArthur does seem to get some of this information, but Kimmel isn't. Short isn't, and it's not because they don't have the information. It's not because they don't think they should be getting the information. It's because no one's checking that they're actually receiving the information. They don't need to. It's as I said in Long Patrol again. Never prescribe to malice what can be put down to stupidity. 99% of the time, it is stupidity, not malice. And the more I read on this, the more I read for it, it is stupidity. And then Kimmel and Short are made sort of scapegoats to protect the. It's not so much from the higher commands from looking stupid. Far worse than them doing something malicious or making a mistake. It's them looking stupid because they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing, what they said they were doing, and what they should have been doing. Because they presumed someone else was doing it, so they didn't need to. Right, Cash, whenever I see those cage tabs, I feel they could have got the job done cheaper by employing some basket weavers. I'm going to keep polite now because my views on cage tabs are well known and I have already been rude enough today, and I'm going to be more sarcastic because, trust me, so far I haven't even touched a little peak of the iceberg of sarcasm which is coming. That's your. You know, I can't help wonder if Kimmel or the other UNSN officers understood how capable that battle cruiser was. I think a fair few of the gunnery officers understood how capable Hood should have been. And let's be honest, if Hood had been upgraded first instead of Renown, there'd been a far more capable ship. Mm-hmm. I find the argument that FDR let Pearl happen untenable. He could have had the casus belli in the Atlantic. FDR felt that public opinion was not ready to go to war. Disresponsible. Unless you World War II Japan, then it was probably malicious. Total final. Never attribute to malice what's caused by stupidity. I gotta remember that one. Story of my life. My goodness. Convincing people of the fact that it's stupidity rather than malice. Mitchell Oates. After 20 years in the USN, I fully agree with stupidity over malice party. Yeah. Just. Or, hello, Strider. It is always stupidity first. It is always stupidity first, and that is depressing. No, those cage masks wouldn't have worked as Faraday cages. In 1926, he goes to the senior course at Naval War College and achieves the rank of captain. Now, interesting enough, I couldn't find a photo of his graduating class from the senior course at Naval War College, but I could find one of an earlier one with Teddy Roosevelt in, and I needed to remind myself that there was a very good president called Roosevelt. That FDR is good in some points, bad in others, and strange in still more, but that there is one Roosevelt president who I have pretty much unending respect for. Don't always agree with him, but I have unending respect for him actually having gone above it. And honestly, here's the point. I can guarantee if Roosevelt had been the president, it wouldn't have been Teddy Roosevelt had been the president. Kimmel would not have been sacked. It would have been Teddy Roosevelt would have gone up and probably told Bob Republican, "I am sorry, this hasn't been done." But there again, Teddy Roosevelt had a note which said the buck stop here, intended to actually check these things for the Senate. I remember during the Great White Fleet and part of its voyage, he makes sure they're getting the information that he has available to send them the relevant information, and makes sure he has an actual White House aide whose job it is to check that the Navy is doing their job of disseminating that information. So, honestly, with this kind of president, you wouldn't have had it. This is one of the problems we're going to get into. There's a constant refrain of some people that, Kimmel was a micromanager. And Kimmel does seem to be orientated to check on the small things. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, an admiral. Yes, an admiral's got to be big picture, but they've got to check the small things are being done. And most of the people who are returning back and going, well, you know, he kept checking if I'd done this. So I'm sort of refrain of going, now, had you actually done it? Well, no, but why should you keep checking if I've done it? Sounds like he's doing his job as an admiral and checking you're passing on information to people who should have it. Marine Bullets. Why was Renown done before Hood anyway? Renown was older and they wanted to test things out on Renown before they did them on Hood. Kimmel was not happy with the decision to nuke his old ship, no. That's good. For all FDR's failings, it was worth remembering he was dealt an awful hand and played it incredibly well, which is why I give him the mixed response. Jingler. So US intelligence was a case of someone, everyone, anyone, and no one. A natural lack of communication in perfect operation. Yep. Wasn't Kimmel a micromanager? Wasn't he forced to become micromanager? Pretty much. You see, Kimmel constantly had trouble with some people who believed the war wasn't coming, so there was no point. In fact, one of his senior officers on December the 6th actually stated, there will never be war with Japan. America is too big, too powerful, and too capable, basically. Which, for some reason, Kimmel did not agree with. And Kimmel thought was stupid to say. But there again, on December 7th, it happened. Well, I guess the UK and US had games with one-up mission. Ergo, Great White Fleet, Empire Cruise. Well, no. You see, when this Great White Fleet is going around the world, Britain already has ships there, so they don't need to do a Great White Fleet. Post World War One, they have, especially post the Washington Naval Treaty, they don't have as many capital ships. They don't have as much significant presence around the world, so they need to start doing Empire cruises to show their presence. Sure. 50 was an author of character, amazing in a lot of ways, but he often seemed to enjoy creating Byzantine bureaucracy and then waiting them to fight over power. There are lots of interesting things about that. Mitchell Oates, the two powerful statement was attributed to Admiral Pye. I'll be getting into Admiral Pye in a second. Anyway, his career peaks in about 1935 when he gets command of USS New York, and he has her for a couple of years. 35, 36. I'm late 35, early 36. And, yeah. He gets USS New York, which is important. Because if I open my particular Excel spreadsheet, which I have not far away from me, which is to do with Monday's video, New York is kind of special. She was laid down in 1911, launched in 1912, and commissioned in 1914. However, she had been been refitted, and New York and Texas have been chosen to be overhauled to increase their speed, armor, and propulsion, as allowed by the Naval Treaty of 1922. And as such, she had been upgraded. In fact, 1929, she has extra anti-aircraft firepower put in front, and she takes part in all the fleet problems in this period. So she would even go on to carry the Admiral on them, the person's personal representative for the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to the UK, and be the sole US Navy representative at the Grand Naval Review in 20th May 1937. So, yeah, New York, more important than you think as a battleship, and not a posting which they're going to just choose any officer for. Mm-hmm. So, big words for someone who'll get a ship shot and out from under him next morning. So, Scott, if they're busy fighting each other, they're not busy fighting him and his attempts to drag the US out of the Great Depression. That was a kind of useful thing for Roosevelt with the various bureaucracies. Nice one. Will you be correcting the tonnage of the QEs and Rs so they aren't lies? Nope. I'm using the tonnage as supplied to the treaties. That is the point. The tonnage is as they were supplied on the treaties, so that's what I'm going for. Those are the official standard tonnage as declared by the Royal Navy in the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty. So that's what we go with. And I'm doing that for every navy. So I'm keeping to those tonnages because then all are on the same level of lies. Lies, I tell you. Ronan Cash, do you think the standards could have been given as much of a speed boost if they'd wanted during their Japanese initiated refits? If they had the time and really wanted to, they probably could have. That's age. Don't worry, there's a long patrol coming on Saturday. That one. If Kimmel could make it there, he could make it anywhere. Yeah, New York. So, this is New York. That's his last, but that's his last ship command because in 1937 he becomes a rear admiral with command of Cruiser Division 7. Well, hey, he's finally got given cruisers and is sent on a diplomatic cruise to South America. This is the last promotion he actually gets. It's important to realize this. This is the last one. All the rest from this point, following US practice at this period, are brevet ranks. Now, the reason they're brevet ranks is because the US Navy is very limited in how many vice admirals and how many full admirals it can actually have. It can't actually have enough to meet its needs. And plus, once they're on the post, it's very difficult to get rid of them. So that means the vast majority of its officer corps are actually rear admirals who are given a brevet rank more senior than their actual rank. This changed in World War II, but this is what they have going on. Actually, even when the tonnage was deliberately wrong. I say everyone's tonnage is deliberately wrong in that treaty. Go and have a look at it. I'll include a link to the text of the treaty I'm using. Now, in 1939, he became commander of the Battle Force cruisers. Again, brevet rank. And in February 1941, he's promoted to replace Admiral James Richardson, who reverted to Rear Admiral himself, as Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, SINCUS, and Commander-in-Chief, United States Pacific Fleet, SINC-PAC Fleet. Now, he doesn't retain SINCUS for that long. It sort of is an interesting one. It ends up going to King and then ends up disappearing when King combines it with Chief of Naval Operations. It's a kind of interesting post. But the point is, for a second time in a row, the US Navy, rather than promoting Vice Admiral, using one of their proper admirals, their very few proper admirals, they have promoted a Rear Admiral brevet rank up to Admiral to take command of the Pacific Fleet. And James/Joe Richardson is, of course, have been the Japan expert. I was asking, what's a brevet rank exactly? It means you're given the rank of something, but you're not actually substantiated in post. So you are acting in that rank. In Cal, was Nimitz a predictable appointment as replacement for Kimmel? As I've said before earlier in the beginning of this, Nimitz is actually offered the post before Kimmel is. Nimitz manages to sidestep it by saying he can't go at this point because of this. And then Kimmel's told, well, you either have to take it or we're going to give it to X. Kimmel, on hearing it could go to X, says, well, basically, might call Nimitz a slightly rude word, and goes, well, that means I have to take it, don't I? Everyone knew they were taking on a poison chalice. Everyone had seen what had happened to Richardson, and everyone knew the task he'd been facing, and they were going to inherit that. Because Richardson had turned from being an officer who was beloved by everyone, and was beloved certainly still by the Navy, who was hated, into someone who was hated by the higher-ups, hated by the Roosevelt administration, because he kept calling them out on what they were doing. And this is going to sound something strange, but if there is anything in there, in the substantiated, or perhaps which might have a kernel of truth in some of the rumors of, them actually doing something through malice, I don't believe in them setting up Pearl Harbor through malice. But I do wonder if the fact that everyone presumed Kimmel was getting magic, rather than checked he was getting magic, was because of the experience of Richardson. Because with all the information Richardson was getting, Richardson, who was a Japan expert, and I'll be getting into this, I guess I'm going to discuss a bit more about Richardson before we get into analysing Kimmel, had been causing them a lot of trouble. And if Kimmel isn't able to cause as much trouble for some reason, I can understand people not checking too much to see if they've remembered to update the list, which means he gets access to all the latest information in full detail. I can understand. I could see that sort of happening, because that would be the kind of stupid bureaucratic idea, which would be a case of, well, then he won't cause us trouble, and we're not really going to have a war with Japan, are we? Not a case of, actually, we want Pearl Harbor to attack, but more a case of, we don't want to keep having political trouble from the Commander Pacific Fleet. So the job of a vice admiral, but the pay and status of a rear. The job of a vice admiral, or the job of a full admiral, but the pay and status of a full admiral, but the pay of a rear, basically. Nice try. Did the US and the UK agree on the weights for everything under the treaty, or not so much? They have to agree definitions under the treaty. Vision. Actually, the USN has a long history of rank. So does the Royal Navy. Commodore, remember, was only actually an established rank in the Royal Navy as of very recently. It had always traditionally been a brevet rank held by a senior captain. Wesley Phillips. Christian Science Monitor is the newspaper put out by the Christian Science Church, generally regarded as a reputable paper, especially in the 1930s and 40s. I am going to stay quiet. But again, I'm not sure I trust their review of a history book. But it is a very decent book. But usually I avoid. It's going to sound strange. I avoid the books which, as a rule, I'm not so keen when they put the review on the front cover. Mitchell, sink us. The one time the acronym turns out being able to appropriate. Yep. Mitchell, brevet rank is still a practice in your for some positions. On subs, lieutenant is given the brevet rank of lieutenant commander if he's made the engineering officer. Random question. What's your take on using garlic powder to make garlic butter? It can work, but you have to be careful. It has to be good quality garlic powder. Good quality stuff. It's far better to use proper garlic. So it's getting admirals on the cheap. Yes, and without having to appeal to the Congress to reform the system. Sir Richard, Doc, I can't see how he can win if he had the right information. Well, how do I put this? Can he win if he has the right information? He might well have had things alerted differently. You might well have had the aircraft more dispersed. If you know it's going to be, if you presume it's going to be an air attack. You might also, as said, you might have had ships out of harbour. If he'd had the reconnaissance aircraft and known where the Japanese were and they were coming from and spotted them, well, he might have called in his own carrier groups. There are options for what he might have done. We'll talk about this later. So, Admiral James Otto Richardson. And that's a picture of him when he commanded the fleet at desk on board the Battle Force flagship in 1939. In January 1940, Richardson became Sinkus. This was considered good, as he was one of the USN's Japanese specialists. If they can say that they have them at this rank, at his rank, and he's certainly the foremost amongst them. He's probably one of the best. If the Naval had an in-house expert on the Japanese military, it was Joe Richardson. Whilst a student at the War College in 1934, he had written a thesis explaining Pearl Harbor was a logical first point of attack for the Japanese High Command, wedded as it was to the theory of undeclared and surprise warfare. Again, do you think the treatment of Admiral Richardson had an effect on how Admiral Kimmel acted in the lead up to the Japanese attack? Would he have been even more vocal? No, he was fairly vocal as it is. I'll be getting into how vocal he is, but he doesn't have the same context information. Richardson is a Japan specialist. He is steeped in Japan. He understands them. He has all the information. He gets pretty much all the intelligence. He is able to be very vocal on Japan. He is sort of from that background and able to talk about it from that perspective. I would argue that Kimmel is more a warfighting officer. He is a technician in making battleships and warships fight. He doesn't come from studying enemy perspective. He's the one who knows, that's the old saying of Sun Tzu. Know your enemy, you'll win X number of battles. Know yourself, you'll know yourself and your enemy, you'll never be defeated, sort of thing. Well, Richardson is a know your enemy admiral. Kimmel is a know yourself admiral. There is nothing wrong with being either. And to extent, Richardson relies on his senior officers to know himself. He does to an extent, and he's fairly good. But he relies on his staff to do that. Kimmel relies on getting into intelligence briefings and the information to know his enemy. Again, that's the whole point of having a staff, because it's very rare you will have an officer who will know themselves and know their enemy. So that is why you have a staff, because then you can mitigate out these individualities, and you can put the best people in the best position to make decisions. And you need for that information to be flowing from both directions. Fundamentally, he believed, and wrote his autobiography, in 1940, the policy-making branch of the government in foreign affairs, the President and Secretary of State, thought that stationing the fleet in Hawaii would restrain the Japanese. They did not ask their senior military advisors whether it would accomplish such an end. They imposed their decision upon them. He'd actually be replaced in post after declaring to Roosevelt, Mr. President, I feel that I must tell you that the senior officers of the Navy do not have the trust and confidence in the civilian leadership of this country. That is essential for the successful prosecution of a war in the Pacific. Yeah, I'm struggling to see how he was fired from his post, but yeah. That's right. He could have made it less of a disaster. He had the right info, i.e. persuading Short to launch a cap. Honestly, the problem is that Short's aircraft weren't allowed to operate further than 15 miles out to sea. So they weren't really what you needed for defending an island. But the reason they weren't allowed to operate further than 15 miles out to sea is the US Army Air Force were obsessed with fear of losing their pilots. in sea crashes. And I should add again, Richardson is one of the most ardent defenders of Kimmel. And I will be getting into some of the things Richardson says about Kimmel later on in this. So this is a really good officer. And this is one of the things which has just been... And I've talked about Richardson before because I've done about him taking command. You know, and this slide has come up before. Yeah, I think he's saying there's a problem in the communication and that people aren't listening to him. And Richardson really didn't want to have his fleet in Hawaii. He didn't think it was a good base for it. He didn't think it was defended enough. He didn't think there was enough security, enough protection. He thought it was the worst place in the world to put a fleet. And again, I will say this. Nimitz, Richardson, Kimmel, Halsey, less so than those two, all pretty much agree about the assessment of what Japan is going to do and what Japan is like. Nimitz is offered the role first. He managed to turn it down. By basically saying, oh no, you need me where I am. I'm so important here. And so Kimmel, as said, gets the call next. And Kimmel goes, well, you know, I wouldn't like to jump in. Has Nimitz said anything? Nimitz is too busy. If I don't take the role, who takes... Well, Mr. Secretary, I serve at the pleasure of the President. And off he goes. That is the history as I read it, as, you know, through the books. I do love the books. There are various ones. There's one book which says Kimmel requested to be relieved of his post after 10 days after Pearl Harbor, which doesn't make sense to me. Because Kimmel is in the middle of planning a counterattack and all sorts of operations at that point. Doesn't seem the point at which an admiral would request to be relieved of command. And one of the interesting things is the guy who takes over is the officer who would have been in charge if Kimmel had said no. And he then pretty much cancels all the operations, and of course, Wake Island falls. But we'll get into that in a bit. I think the problem is there are a lot of officers in Washington and a lot of politicians in Washington who had no understanding of Japan. And they didn't want to listen to the very few who had any understanding of Japan. So, here is some Pearl Harbor background. This is an idea of what the good, the lovely Richardson had been saying. The location of the US fleet in Hawaiian waters would act as a deterrent to the Japanese only so long as its positioning did not appear to be the Japanese as solely a bluff. In 1938, the original detachment created in Hawaii was 2 heavy cruiser divisions, 2 destroyer squadrons, a single aircraft carrier, and a supporting ship's personnel, which is basically a scouting force. Interesting enough, one of the first officers sent out there is Kimmel. In May 1940, Admiral Richardson was ordered to release a press release stating he requested permission to remain in Hawaiian waters to accomplish some things I wanted to do while here. He was told to stay there for 2 weeks. He'd made no such request, as both ammunition and targets were in short supply in Hawaii, as there was precious little he could do. That situation would not change that much for Richardson during his tenure, and would not change for Kimmel. In January 1941, Richardson was relieved of command early by Admiral Kimmel. His complaining about the position of the fleet undermined his role in the eyes of Roosevelt. Now, I've talked about one statement he did, but also this is a statement which Admiral Richardson had actually sent up before he was relieved, before he even sent that lovely note to Roosevelt. Opinion: the presence of the fleet in Hawaii might influence a civilian government, but that Japan had a military government which knew that the fleet was undermanned, unprepared for war, and had no training or auxiliary ships, without which it could not undertake active operations. I further stated that there was more likely to make the Japanese feel that we were meant business if a train were assembled and a fleet returned to the Pacific coast, the complements filled, the ships docked and fully supplied of ammunition, provisions, stores, and fuel, and then stripped for war operations. Now, you will have heard me in the beginning talking about what Kimmel gets up to with Halsey, and you will know that he strips the ships for war operations. Kimmel takes this decision on his own head because he really doesn't have permission to do it. And there are people who actually try and tell him off for it. But he basically has enough permission, he feels. There's enough leeway in the statements he's been sent that he feels he can do it. But some people still consider it precipitous and warmongering. Georgine, based on the timeline, Wake Island would have fallen anyway. Pye's order of ordering release force comes less than 24 hours before Wake is lost. Yes and no. Pye had delayed the sending of the force, and then we'll get into that in a bit. But honestly, no. There are people who try and defend Pye, and I have no respect for Pye at all, because he seems to spend his entire life slagging off his commanding officers, and thinking he should be in charge. Which, if you consider, if things have been based on order of seniority, he should have been, because he's a vice admiral, but he's not, which suggests his equality. The UK had some understanding with Japan, but I'm not sure if it was. Let's put it this way: it's not a magic 8-ball, and the British had been also distracted by being focused on war, so they dropped the ball as well. If he puts the fleet to sea and puts them out of the way, would an air melee over Hawaii be a better outcome? Potentially, but I doubt he would have put the fleet out to sea to go do an air melee over Hawaii. He'd have put the fleet out to sea to go and attack the Japanese carriers. Otherwise, Saratoga would have run into 2 Jap fleet flag carriers. Well, again, there's the forces which. George, we're going off topic because I'm going to be covering this in the end. But the point is, the forces that. Let's put it this way. Kimmel's planning for what he wanted to send to Wake Island and what actually gets sent to Wake Island are different things. But he could have sent a viable force, and he was considering sending a viable force, which could certainly have made the Japanese fleet carriers problematic and could possibly have bounced them. But, the thing is, they know the attack's coming on Wake, especially after it's happened, the first attack. And Kimmel's initial instinct is to immediately send things. So leadership style. This is what he writes after getting the post on the 18th of February. I feel that a surprise attack, submarine, air, or combined, on Pearl Harbor is a possibility, and we are taking immediate practical steps to minimize the damage inflicted and ensure that the attacking force will pay. That is what he's trying. That is his guiding priority. And there is a debate. I can understand some people saying, okay, he's a micromanager because he's obsessing. The micromanager point, I do love some of the things that comes through. It goes, well, in meetings, he used to return to small details to check they've been done in subsequent meetings. You mean, in other words, he checked if you'd done your work? I mean, that's terrible for an admiral to do with his staff. The British had... Gonna sound strange. The British have a fair amount of information on the Japanese, but again, both sides have fairly decent information to an extent. And as Dirt Squad says, more senior people had exposure to Japan, and there'd been the Anglo-German naval, Anglo and the Japanese naval alliance, and there is the traditionally far better Anglo-Japanese relations, with the British forces having a permanent presence in the China station, which had often had very good relations with their Japanese counterparts and often interacted, which meant whilst there was also still that group of basically whites, what can we do? Stereotype stereotype thought limited people. There was also a large number of people who in the Royal Navy who had a lot of practical experience of Japan and understanding, which affects things. I'm not answering that one, 9681, because that's completely off today's topic. I do love you adding these questions in, and I know where they come from. They come from passion of history, but it's completely off today's topic. That's right. That's kind of wrong. I was thinking some British knew more and believed more of what they heard of the Japanese. Yeah. Do you think they could get the standards near the Japanese carriers? No. I agree with Nimitz. If Kimmel had deployed the battleships, there is no way they could have caught the Japanese carriers. Jack Ray, a lot at work today. I had to check if things were done. They saw they weren't. They go ask the responsible developers if the tasks were done. These are developers that are newer. I leave trusted old hands to do it though. Yes. Well, the trouble is, Kimmel found he had some people he could trust. Halsey, a couple of others, and he had some admirals who he basically had to sit on top of to get them to do any work. No, from my Japanese grammar, those people were too busy with their pies and sugar cookies to not look up and see what was happening. That's a cool one. Right. So, here is another problem. Thanks, Knights Agaron. That'll be good. Brew ships will be a perfect day to discuss that. Or, there is a reason for the way they put the things out in the treaty. This, of course, is Ranger, Lexington, and Saratoga, and they're at Hawaii during April 1938, during Fleet Problem 19. In 1941, the CNO Stark cancels Fleet Problem 22. Now, he does this because the Navy's under strain and effort and all these things supporting it, but also he does it, and here is the really cool thing, right? He does it because there aren't the supplies at Hawaii to support it. And he can't free up any ships to send supplies over to Hawaii to support it, because those ships are too busy shuttling supplies to and through, back and forth between the various bases on the US coasts. Now, don't take this the wrong way, but here is the thing. Hawaii is supposed to be your deterrent fleet that is going to deter the Japanese from starting a war. They're so short of supplies, you can't have a major exercise there, and you have to cancel it, which is a frontline. I think it's a frontline news story, a front page news story in several newspapers. That it's cancelled. Certainly makes it into pretty much every newspaper, I'm told, by some sources. It's in the books. I haven't gone and checked newspapers. It's in the books that this happens. I have no desire to go and check all the newspapers and archives to see if it is or isn't. But the point is, it definitely does make news and is spotted by the Japanese. Which kind of tells them all they need to know about the readiness of the fleet in Hawaii, doesn't it? These fleet problems are the big status of the US Navy. They're the massive historic things. They are the things the US Navy's built like. It'll be like the Royal Navy cancelling in 1939 its annual exercise in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. It doesn't. It does them. Make sure it does them with full vim and vigor. It does everything it can to make sure they're as big, as powerful as they've ever been, even more so. Every ship they can possibly grab is brought there to go, ooh, look at us, how big we are. Again, this is the point at which you should be going. If you're the CNO, I can't support an exercise. Perhaps I should withdraw something from Hawaii so I can better support what's already there. Rick Varsava, was not also the State Department's fault for not knowing that the oil embargo would force Japan to act? Well, they just... Yeah, you can put it down on the State Department to an extent, yes, but also you have to remember the State Department believed that Japan would break and crumble. They didn't think they'd do anything, because after all, they're the Japanese. They're these Orientals. They're weak. They're not going to fight. Have you looked at the Russo-Japanese War? Well, that was the Russians, not against the proper war. The Russians, they're not, I can just imagine someone in the US State Department saying, well, that's the Russians. They're not proper stock. Or something like that. Some lovely euphemism. PH09, random question. If the US Navy suddenly had the RN's roster of admirals instead, which British admiral would have been given Kimmel's command? Considering how lucky Kimmel was and how overworked? Probably Somerville. With cunning and managing to dodge it. Dev Squad, Strider. I think there was also a certain culture on top levels of the US military in DC. We're the best. No one knows more than us. No other nation is better at war than we are. It led to a very rude awakening. Pearl Harbor, Kasserine Pass, and the efficiency of Luftwaffe interceptors became the mind. That was all sort of on. Going on, as well as the interaction between the RN and IGN, do you think that the fact that the RN had a long history of having sailors from almost every country in the world in their ranks helped with assessments? No. I think it's more a long history of the RN being everywhere in the world, and they didn't just go for visits, they were stationed there for years, so you build up more of an understanding if you're stationed in the place for years. John Mac, I wonder if a more effective deterrent is to announce a massive crash build facilities in Hawaii and leave it in between the lines that it will become the major base. That would probably have been sensible. instead of being announced in, I don't know, 1937, 1938. Well, you know, when they first go there in 1938, so if 1939 they announced that, that would have been something. If you are going to make Hawaii into your major forward base, you need to sustain it. Here is something that scares me. Okay? There are points at which in this period the British are honestly investing more in Singapore than America is investing in Hawaii. There are points. I'm not saying it's continuous. I'm not saying it's all the time. But if you think about it, Britain's in the middle of a war, which is the other side of the world. And honestly, the fact that they can find any resources for Singapore is a surprise. America is not yet fighting a war. They are doing all they're doing with Japan in terms of the State Department embargoes and blockades, well, de facto blockades, all those things. And they're not doing anything for their principal base. It's a fun one. So, on the 6th of December, 1941, Vice Admiral William Sadley Pye, who will not lose his post or be critiqued in any way, spoke and said, "The Japanese will not go to war with the United States. We are too big, too powerful, and too strong." How would I reinforce Pearl Harbor? How would I reinforce Pearl Harbor? More scout aircraft. The easiest way to reinforce Pearl Harbor is scout aircraft, and that's the thing which is most important. Honestly, that is the thing that really matters. There are various accounts of what happens during Pearl Harbor and to Kimmel. What we are fairly certain is the account of Edwin Layton, who's one of the officers with Kimmel at the time. Kimmel stood by the window of his office at the submarine base, his jaw set in stony anguish. As he watched the disaster across the harbour unfold with terrible fury, a spent .50 caliber machine gun bullet crashed through the glass. It brushed the Admiral before it clanged to the floor. It cut his white jacket and raised a welt on his chest. "It would have been merciful had it killed me," Kimmel murmured to his communications officer, Commander Maurice Germany Kurtz. I'm not so sure about the claim from the War of the World, which was a sort of scenario where there's a sailor claims that Kimmel, during the attack, rips off his 4-star shoulders borders in apparent recognition of the impending end of his command. I don't think he does. That sounds a bit overly dramatic for Kimmel to me, so from what I built up with him. And well, in the 10 days, he tries to send a larger force to Wake Island. Basically, what happens, well, how do I put this politely? First of all, various officers seem to be going behind Kimmel's back and going, "Oh no, it's too risky, it's too risky." Mostly enough, they're the same officers who, prior to the attack, were saying, "We're not going to get attacked, we're not going to get attacked." If you want to see the officers who were really shocked by the attack and what happened, most of them turn into turtles, suddenly scared of their shadows. You know, there are scenes where Halsey's basically shouting at officers that Admiral sends out a signal that goes, to an extent, when a ship of sea says a signal, if we continue attacking neutral fish to the level we're going to be doing, we'll have no torpedoes left for the Japanese. Or rather, if every false torpedo attack is shouted as being is predicted to be Japanese, every possible trace is treated as a Japanese torpedo, the Japanese Navy will have run out of torpedoes. It's amazing how quickly the very same officers who had been telling Kimmel he was being too aggressive, he was being micromanaging, making them get ready for war, he was all this, turn and start saying, you weren't doing enough to prepare us for war, we can't do anything, we don't have anything, we can't do anything, we don't do anything, you can't do this. It's quite interesting. The force he originally wants to send to Wake, because he predicts Wake is going to be the next target, pretty much, is he wants to send everything he can in the direction of Wake, which would have been more than one carrier, which would have been enough forces that, honestly, the Japanese force might well have been sunk. He doesn't get to do that. He's talked down. He's basically told he can't do that. You can't do that. That's too much, too risk, too high risk, too high risk. They are literally, they're in shock. Their mental image of themselves being invincible and therefore Japan would never attack them has taken a complete 180, and now Japan is everywhere. They're massive bogeymen who are going to wipe them out at the slightest thing, and therefore they have to cringe and hide and cringe and hide and cringe and hide and go, it's the whole, the Japanese. That's what they turn into. And we've all met people like that in our lives. They're massive egotists who presume no one's ever going to hurt them. They're basically, it's a trait of bullies, but it's also a trait of some people who have a very well sense of ego who are not bullies. And I do not believe in any way, shape, or form all these naval officers are bullies. I think they just have a very, very strong self-image of themselves, which means they believe no one else could do this sort of thing. Possibly they believed the Royal Navy could have, but the Royal Navy wasn't the ones carrying this out. The Japanese Navy were. And there is always this sort of line in the US Navy. There's what they think the Royal Navy might do, and there's what they think everyone else might do. And that the Royal Navy are sort of the peers. And even sometimes they're going, we're better than the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy would be going, yeah, but you would set up to fight, we'd let you get set up all the way to fight the battle your way, and then we'd fight it ours. David Scott to Colin Cameron. Add the Royal Navy's habitual addiction to spying on absolutely everybody, if at all possible. This looks like a very well kept and run ship, Captain. Could you by chance show us around? Yes. Alternatively, hello, gentlemen. We bring whiskey, beer. Universally got us aboard many ships. Is that how they fought with Japan back then? They weak and won't do anything. Things sort of gosh. Yes, and I'll be getting into some of this when I'm doing the Washington Naval Treaties impact next week on Monday. You know, what a fair treaty would have been. I'm not reading that one out, Jonathan Burrow, but it wouldn't surprise me. Take care, gentlemen. Operator 8282. Hello. Given the logistical issues at Pearl Harbor from the late 30s to months after being attacked, how culpable could have Kimmel been, as he has been screaming for equipment supplies needed from day one? Pretty much my argument is not culpable in any way, shape, or form. Honestly, there's the old people go, well, he should have had his aircraft out that way, but he didn't. He has enough aircraft to really cover 60 degrees. So here is the first turn of the screw in trying to put the blame on Kimmel. First of all, he's sacked from post. So that immediately makes him look culpable in front of the eyes of the British eyes of the American public, etc. And then they have the Roberts Commission. It's appointed by President Franklin Roosevelt to investigate the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Roberts was a Republican justice who had been appointed by President Hoover, but was considered fair. And it was noted that several critical points of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, etc., had depended upon Roberts' votes to make sure the Supreme Court didn't strike them down. But he is fair. Now, Kimmel, this report determined that Kimmel and his counterpart, Army Lieutenant General Walter Scott, were guilty of errors of judgment and derelict of duty in the events leading up to the attack. Although it also exonerates their subordinates and ignores completely more senior officers and civilian leadership. It also didn't acknowledge in any way, shape, or form the fact that information had not been passed on to Kimmel. It's an interesting hatchet job in some respects. That's good. The offer of alcohol was a very useful method of gaining intelligence of the US Navy. The entire Royal Navy history of relations to the US Navy. We'll come over to visit your ship, have a lovely tour. Then what we'll do is we'll host you to dinner on ours with alcohol. Yes, please. Now, I find the Roberts Commission interesting because it is done in a time of war, so they are very much restricting information they're given, and a lot of information is sealed. Now, what happens, Roberts Commission? Every time I put it in the quotes like that, Microsoft Word gets annoyed with me and starts doing funny things with my title. Microsoft PowerPoint does, so it's not, but it's the Roberts Commission. And besides, there's the title up there. That was bad enough, and honestly, that leads to Kimmel trying to fight to protect his to get his reputation and sort that out and protect that, and he's having to deal with that, and that probably starts off him not having any success, him not getting any posts in World War II. So, he does, even though the US Navy is short of admirals and is desperately short of admirals, Kimmel is not appointed. One thing. That's good. Would the authors of the report have been made aware of the intelligence not being supplied to Kimmel? Would Ultra have been deemed too secret to tell the Commission existed? Yes, no, they weren't aware of intelligence not being supplied to Kimmel because they weren't read into the fact the intelligence exists in the first place. It's called Magic for Japan. Ultra is Germany. And, they didn't really get it, information. Sure, Mac, as I've said earlier, and I'll say this again, if you go back to here, Kimmel doesn't actually have those ranks. Sure, I haven't bothered to look into, but Kimmel's rank is Rear Admiral. He is promoted by brevet to Vice Admiral and then brevet to Admiral. He's never actually commissioned to those ranks. So he's acting in that role. He's not given that rank. So honestly, being reduced to Rear Admiral is what happens. It also happens to Richardson. That's what happens to James Richardson. After succeeding Secretary Knox on the latter's death, James Forrestal gets involved and orders a Navy Court of Inquiry. I'm not sure whether he is someone out to aggressively protect Roosevelt's reputation or is just someone seeking vengeance for Pearl Harbor. But he has an inquiry composed of people who actually are read into the information intelligence. Comprised of Admiral Adolphus Andrews, Admiral Orrin G. Murphy, and who served as President of the Court, and Admiral Edward Calbalfus. It sat daily from the July 24th, 1944 to October 19th, 1944, interviewing numerous witnesses in Washington, Hawaii, and all over the place. It largely exonerates Kimmel, finding his actions and decisions had been correct given the limited information available to him. Focusing instead on the previous Chief of Naval Operations, Harold R. Stark, for failing to pass on warnings and check information was dispatched in a timely manner. The court's findings were sealed as they revealed the cryptography success against IJN codes. It's interesting now, this is the first inquiry which has access to the full information available as well as the list of who it's distributed to. So even more interesting is Forrestal isn't happy. He felt they're being too lenient in assigning blame for the disaster, instead of focusing on lessons to be learnt. He would conclude, these officers, referring to Kimmel and Short, failed to demonstrate the superior judgment necessary for exercising command commensurate with their rank and their assigned duties. Okay. So, there is a rant going on in the Long Patrol about this, and there is going to be a rant now about this, and there are going to be similarities and differences between those rants, and I look forward to the commentary about the differences. But here is the point. They are not fricking Jedi Knights! I'm sorry for shouting, but they are not. They are not Jedi Knights. They are not using the Force. They are officers. They are professional officers. They are acting on information they have available. Yes, you can expect them to use their rank and their experience and estimates in themselves to fill in some of the gaps, but they are not physically possible to go mentally and go, I can see the Japanese are coming here when they haven't got information, and go, oh, the Japanese fleet is going to come from that direction when you've told me they're all coming from that direction. But oh, I know they're coming from that direction. I have magically managed to gather my forces and we will attack them. That's just not going to happen. You are holding them to a standard higher than humans can be held to. What is the superior judgment you expect? Them to go, I know the enemy's plan? How? What kind of twaddle are you talking? This is... I am a historian. I am critical of people. I do admit this, and I do have the benefit of hindsight when I'm critical. It's part of being a historian. You sometimes have to point out where they make mistakes and where they do good things. You have to be fair. And I know I occasionally get comments on my videos on the Malay Peninsula, etc., that I'm overly critical of the officers involved. But the reason I'm critical is they have the information and they don't act on it. In which case, they are actually failing in their role. That is the difference. They have the information, they don't act on it. They have a reservoir, they have positions in there to defend it, and they don't put any troops there when they have some there. And I know they have some there, and they have some troops available to go in it, because they have a whole load of troops sitting there which they haven't deployed anywhere because they forgot about them. So, that is the reason I'm critical. I am not I would never justify being critical of officers not acting on information they do not have, because they cannot physically act on information they do not have. You're asking them to guess and discern the entire enemy battle plan from from thin air. Now, I will also tell you that Admiral Jellicoe, of course, famously deploying the Grand Fleet, manages to do that twice. But that is in this unique scenario of the Battle of Jutland. That is in the scenario of the effort of the times, and that is in the scenario of him having some information to base it on, and him making a guess based on information. Not in him having no information and still managing to work out the enemy plan. Admittedly, if it had been left to BT, that would have been the scenario. But Jellicoe manages to work it out. You are asking Kimmel and you are asking Short to work out things beyond their ken from no information. There is no way they can do that. July. I am 100% pro-Richmond. He was absolutely right to want the fleet in San Diego, and I would have had the base, the RM in Colombo, Australia. Probably in Ceylon, in Trincomalee. In my case, that would have been where my fleet would have been operating from, but that's me. Manapanta, in regards to Forrestal, the only suitable quote for him comes from Comrade Diatov. He's delusional, get him out of here. Major, I thought magic was diplomatic codes, ultra was military code breaking. Usually Ultra comes from Enigma decrypts, which are usually the German ones, which are based on more often military, but including some German diplomatic. Magic refers more often to the decryptions of Japanese cryptography, which usually refers to their diplomatic ones because their navy and their army also had their own separate things, whereas the Germans tended to use Enigma for everything because the Germans believed Enigma was uncrackable. And actually, one of the advantages comes in later in war when the Japanese get some Enigma codes because the translation of documents from get some Enigma machines. The translation of documents from Enigma machines transmissions allows us to translate some of the other codes the Japanese were using because we get to see what the code was like in the Enigma transcript. Sure. Also, the language of superior judgment indicates that he knew that all their actions would be what was expected of us in that position. Operator 822, I believe the Japanese code was called purple. One of them was. The Russians, did the American Navy issue crystal balls? I'm fairly sure that's what Kimmel needed. To live up to their requirements, that's what he would have needed. So here is Admiral Halsey's summation of it. Even then, I think everyone present knew that the disaster would be formally investigated, but I'll take my oath that not one of us would have guessed that the blame would fall on Kimmel, because not one of us thought he deserved it, only part of it. I want to emphasize my next statement. In all my experience, I have never known a commander-in-chief of any United States fleet who worked harder under more adverse circumstances to increase its efficiency and prepare it for war. Further, I know of no officer who might have been in command at that time who could have done more than Kimmel did. I also want to repeat and emphasize the answer I made when the Roberts Commission asked me how I happened to be ready for the Japanese attack. I told them, because of one man, Admiral Kimmel. Who then is to blame? Look at it logically. The attack succeeded because Admiral Kimmel and General Short could not give Pearl Harbor adequate protection. They could not give it because they did not have it to give. They did not have it because Congress would not authorize it. Congress is elected by the American people, and the blame for Pearl Harbor rests squarely on the American people and nowhere else. Instead of trying to dodge our responsibility by besmirching two splendid officers, we should be big enough to acknowledge our mistakes and wise enough to profit by them. His usual, one has to admire Halsey for his ability to pull his punches and speak in such, such hidden phraseology. You really have to work hard to get the meaning from his words. It's so difficult to discern what he's really trying to say. Again, not always the biggest fan of Halsey, but let's be honest, that is rather an interesting and direct point here. And it takes a lot of guts to turn up and say, you know what, who's responsible for Pearl Harbor? It's not them, it's all of you. And he shows it quite simply. They don't have it to give. They do not have it to give. It's one of those really interesting points. One of the interesting points, again, I find is the number of people who try and claim that Kimmel, thinking his main fleet, threat to his fleet was sabotage, kept the fleet in port. Well, as I said, that directly contributes quite a lot of the admirals on the sign there who say, well, he's got his fleet organised in task forces, and there's never more than one in port at any one time. The trouble is, he doesn't have the sustainment to keep more of his fleet out at sea. He can sustain 2/3 of his fleet out at sea at any one point because he doesn't have the supply ships, the fleet auxiliaries, etc., to actually put more out at sea at any one point. He can only do what he has the ability to do within the facilities he has available. He cannot be asked to do more. The thing is, though, if you can see this, whilst he blames Congress, he says Congress is elected by the American people. That's the point. Halsey is not blaming Congress. He's blaming Congress. He says Congress are at fault, but Congress are elected by the American people. So therefore, it's the American people who are responsible. That's one. How is someone meant to sabotage a task group when it's at sea? That's one of the interesting things. You know, that there are some points which are made about Kimmel and accusations made by various factions of the government, etc., in the 1940s and during the 1943-44 period especially, which just don't make sense. I mean, they're completely circular. I mean, I look at them and I just go, yeah, what are they doing? This is from, it's linked to down below. There's an article down below. Richardson was still in uniform when Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal sent for me and told me he was not satisfied with a report of Naval Court of Inquiry into Pearl Harbor. Remember this inquiry back here by the Murphin. So after this, Richardson concludes this and then sends for... No, I mean after this, Forrestal concludes that and then sends for Richardson and would have another investigation made. He then stated he would like me to undertake the investigation for him. I said, Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry, but I'm not able to do such an assignment because I'm prejudiced, and I believe that no prejudiced officer should undertake the inquiry. Forrestal asked me what he meant. Richardson responded, I am prejudiced because I believe that any fair and complete investigation will result in placing a part of the blame for the success of the attack upon the President. Now, to me, this gives more indication that Forrestal is a useful idiot rather than someone who actually believes he's covering up for the president by attacking Kimmel, etc. And it's kind of interesting. He goes to the Japan expert, still the acknowledged Japan Navy expert, who's been kept again back in Washington to keep him away from the war, who lost his post and was demoted to Rear Admiral because of his clashes with Roosevelt. And he goes to him thinking he will back him up versus Kimmel. And the thing is, Richardson won't. Yeah, I do think that, Mitchell Oates, I do think this should have had a mic drop at the end. That would have added, that's the modern twist which would have been added. I'm prejudiced because I believe that any fair and complete investigation will result in placing a part of the blame for the success of the attack upon the president. Oh. And honestly, you can see that where that comes from, because if you make one change, you can avoid a lot of the success of the attack. And that one change is the scout aircraft. If you have sufficient reconnaissance aircraft, you have a lot harder time for the Japanese to get in range. And successful scout aircraft, people often ask me for figures. Right, Kimmel, and I'll be getting this, has enough aircraft to cover 60 degrees. You need at least to cover 360 degrees. You're supposed to cover 360 degrees, but let's be honest, you're unlikely to have an attack coming from the east. Now, you are likely to have an attack possibly coming from the north or south, so I would argue you'd be wanting to cover at least 240 degrees. So, leaving 120 degrees probably barely covered. But if you have enough aircraft to cover 240, you can probably occasionally send something to cover the other 120. So, you need to basically 4 times the number of scout aircraft Kimmel had to be able to have security and safety. 4 times. Here is an interesting point. Now, this is from a speech, which also should be linked down below, I think it's linked, but from Captain Forrest Tex Baird. And I'm going to use it to explain who someone who I'm going to be quoting from in a second is. Then there was this person, a very special person, who did not serve in a dungeon with us, but who deserves a very high-ranking place in the list of 5 expanded to make it 6. He luckily worked above the ground in the fresh Hawaiian air. He was another human dynamo, sharp, quick-thinking, fast-acting, intuitive, fast to comprehend, and extremely aggressive. In prior assignments, he'd been a Tokyo Japanese language student and later a codebreaker. And on December the 31st, he moved from Admiral Kimmel's staff to continue on as Admiral Nimitz' young intelligence officer. He was Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Layton, Naval Academy class of 1924. Layton and I found many intelligence interests in common, having almost nothing to do with dungeon work. So I came to know him very well and to appreciate fully his tremendous contributions to our results. Joe Rothschild and Eddie Layton were close friends of long standing. They had studied the Japanese language together in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932. Here at Pearl Harbor, they worked together in complete harmony, forming an almost perfect team. Rothschild gave Layton a remarkably clear and reliable estimates, analyses. The quick-witted Layton might then add comments and suggestions or more analysis, and that he had to sell the final product to Admiral Nimitz. Thank heavens, a very hard-pressed Admiral Nimitz quickly learned to trust Rothschild's Layton duo. That brought him his very restricted, highly secret information, which some others in his staff at first were prone to put down as guesswork, even as dangerous guesswork. Please note, one of the officers who recommended, in fact, the most important recommendation Nimitz received for Layton was from Kimmel. That's how much Nimitz trusted Kimmel. And to be fair, this is returned because Edward Layton writes in his book, and I was there, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Breaking Secrets, in 1985, published in 1985, and had stood up for Kimmel during all the reviews and said that Kimmel had done deployed the few reconnaissance resources in the most logical way, given the available information. Because here was the available information that Layton, who was Kimmel's chief intelligence officer, had. Jalute Atoll in the Marshall Islands lay 2,000 nautical miles to the southwest, and traffic analysis indicated a powerful submarine force there. It was also thought at least one carrier division was making for Japanese bases in the Marshalls, and further reconnaissance was ordered to settle a difference in analysis. Kimmel had to make his plans on the assumption that the main danger to Pearl Harbor in the event of war was an enemy task force steaming out to make a surprise attack from the southwest. At no time did Kimmel receive any intelligence or hint that there was any threat to Pearl Harbor from any direction but from the southwest. This is why, with only enough air assets to cover a 60-degree portion of the island's approach, Kimmel has them focused on the southwest because that's where he's told the attack's going to come. He doesn't have enough to cover the full area. If he tried to cover the full area, he would lose aircraft, he'd lose men, he'd lose a lot of people. So he has to do it this way. He has to do his best using what he has available. And what he has available is not much. So that's why it happens. There is one change you can make that would probably prevent Pearl Harbor happening, and that would be reconnaissance assets. Because if Kimmel knows the Japanese are at sea, i.e. has that information, and has the reconnaissance assets out, then he probably has his fleet out at the sea. And as Nimitz says, that could well lead to American battleships getting sunk in deeper water, and them losing a lot more crew and a lot more ships for a lot longer permanently than if he doesn't. But even if he isn't given the intelligence, if he's allowed to keep the reconnaissance assets so he can maintain a 240-degree protection, covering most of his island, most of the area around his island, then he gets warning that the Japanese are coming in. Then he probably sends the battleships to sea and probably sends them out east. At least until they meet up with the carrier groups, because that would be standard American doctrine. You don't want to engage enemy carrier forces at sea without carriers, especially if you can't catch them. He'd also probably at that point be mobilizing, telling General Short to send all his bombers to attack them. So the Japanese would suddenly be having bombs raining down on them, and World War II might start in the Pacific with an American bomber force attacking Japan before there's even been a declaration of war. Well, the Japanese fleet. So again, it's easy to be critical of presidents, but he did have a lot of commitments to try to cover without us lacking funding to do so. Yes, but he was also the one who made the decision to put his fleet in Hawaii, and he was the one who forgot to fund Hawaii. A nice way, if you're going to stick your fleet out of way, as far within extreme striking range of the Canadian side, but also within an extreme range of your own logistical support, then you need at least to support it. How about everyone? Dan, stop trying to wind everyone up. So, right. Back in a second. I've just been asked to go check the greenhouse because apparently they're worried the door might be open. So, read that. Back in a second. Where are my keys? I don't know. Why about their plants getting cold? Temperature's dropped apparently. Coming. Greenhouse door is closed. Well, now it is. Lucky Foxy hadn't got in, but Foxy was looking at it. I think Foxy was wondering if it was going to be a warm thing for the evening. Back we go. Hello again. Apologies for that. Okay. Has Dan continued causing trouble in the chat? George Jr. So a failure of leadership at all levels of command from FDR down. Pretty much. Come on, the Daily Fox moment. No Foxy this time. Just the lovely, joyous greenhouse. There are a lot of things which tend to happen about this time of night. I do know, but yeah. Zora 2828. Steve Richards, I believe there was a squadron of Catalinas for recon. Yes, pretty much it's the Catalinas which are the reconnaissance aircraft. The bombers aren't being used for reconnaissance, not in terms of the range or the operation of them, but there aren't enough Catalinas, there aren't enough aircraft for reconnaissance at all. And that is part of the reason why there is actually flying fortresses flying in during the attack, because they're trying to strengthen up the air groups. It's right up. It's only southwest. Well, they did know they should cover the full 360 degrees. They didn't have the aircraft to cover the full 360 degrees, so they had to pick. That's what you do. You force an admiral to pick. That's what they did. They forced an admiral to pick. We're not going to give you enough aircraft to cover 360 degrees. Okay, how many are you going to give me? Enough to cover 60. Oh. Well, what am I supposed to do then? Well, you can either try and cover the full 360 degrees and have no cover, because you'd be putting the aircraft under so much strain, the pilots under so much strain, and you barely be getting one patrol covering any territory at all a day, so would most likely miss any group trying to operate through. Or you could do it properly and cover 60 degrees, and that's what he does, because he's got a likely angle of an attack, so he gets things focused on that. David Tranter, and of course, if the USN fleet sortied and attacked the Kido Butai before they attacked Pearl Harbor, the conspiracy nuts would claim the IJM was never going to attack and it was all a bluff. Probably. No, worry about the interruption. Night security is fine. I'm fairly sure I already did the annoying about BT. Something clear. Foxy in the greenhouse. No, she was looking at the greenhouse. She wasn't in the greenhouse. There again, that would suggest the reason why she's in the garden if she is considering using the greenhouse as her den. Quite a nice den for a fox, it would be. Mitch writes, I read Edward Layton's book many years ago, early 90s. It's a good one. Good luck, Stafford. Moving a cast iron railroad switch is fun. In addition, the B-17 was originally ordered for sea reconnaissance. The planes even had the big glass blisters on the sides, like the flying boats. Some of them did, but unfortunately not enough in that area. Don't worry, MacArthur will surely make good use of the planes. You have to, at a certain point when you start looking at this whole scenario, you start realizing that there is a modern perception and a conceit, even, that it's only these days that we divide things into ones and zeros. Good guys and bad guys. Good and evil. All that. But no. It's like, in Pearl Harbor, there's not a single person really to blame. There's a system to blame. And in nicest way, there are a whole range of people who should have been making sure that Kimmel and Short got all the information they needed. There's a whole range of people who should have made sure they had the reconnaissance aircraft they needed. But all of them were making assumptions, based on assumptions, based on assumptions, based on assumptions. And in the end, the house of cards collapsed. And when we talk about House of Cards, you can also talk about the House of Cards that the whole Force Z was put on. We can talk about the various House of Cards which were built during World War II. There are often balancing competing houses of cards. They're not actually properly built up formations and, you know, bricks and mortar. Kimmel's fault, if any, is that he's in charge when the House of Cards the bluff gets called. As Richardson has put it, it's a bluff putting the fleet in Hawaii. It is a bluff because you can't support it. So it is a bluff. And what's the key example of you can't support it? Well, you can't maintain all the ships posturing out at sea, which is the safest position for them. Everyone knows after Taranto, no, the US Navy doesn't need a report to know that after Taranto, fleets in harbour are not safe positions. Everyone's known a fleet in harbour is not a safe position. You know, anyone who's studied British history, half the Royal Navy's history involves them attacking fleets moored in harbour to make sure they don't ever come out again. Because a fleet you know the presence of is a fleet you can deal with. And that's the point. They don't have that. So, what is going on? Well, what is going on is you've got a nation rapidly preparing for war. You've got a line from Marshall. I'm overloaded with paperwork. I have so much paper. I'm not a copy machine. I'm not a machine. I'm human, and that is ultimately what all the command structure is. They're all humans, and they're making assessments, and they have massive egos. America had secured absolute supremacy in the Washington Naval Treaty. That's what they realized. They realized the Japanese Navy wanted a 10-7 ratio because a 10-7 ratio meant that America couldn't guarantee a quick victory if they attacked Japan, because a 10-7 is not enough superiority of force for that. So they pushed for the Japanese minimum, which was a 5-3 ratio, which made the Japanese feel insecure from that moment onwards. Well, they won that one, and that gave the Americans confidence. With the Americans having that much confidence, they don't invest. They don't need to invest because they have a treaty guaranteed superiority over the Japanese. And that superiority disappears quickly. Halsey points out they underestimate the qualities and capabilities of the Japanese naval aviation. In later years, you will often hear, people talking about how the Japan is overestimating the quality of their ships and how much their quality can make up for the US Navy's quantity. Well, one of the conceits you have in the US Navy of 1941 amongst a large number of officers is that the Japanese Navy isn't the quality. That they aren't up to snuff. And again, the Royal Navy has a slight advantage in this one because they fought alongside them in World War One. They saw what the Japanese and the US Navy got up to. Yes, there are still officers who have that kind of mindset, but they are far fewer and far less prevalent in the Royal Navy because of that experience than in the US Navy. Tim and Ellen Moran. Forrestal kept sprints from a 5th star. Yeah, Forrestal did all sorts of fun things. On July 1944, how many days steaming from San Diego to Pearl Harbor? 3? Probably 4. Most of 4. So you're telling me, Mr. Layton, that we have no idea where the Japanese carriers are. For all we know, they could be at the moment Could at any moment come steaming around Diamond Head. Love that quote in his book. Mitchell Derp Squad. There is rarely a single point of blame in any situation. If a system allows a single person to cause a failure, it's a bad system. Single point of failure is bad design. And 2,403 people died because of those failures. Yep. George Union, part of British history is their navy getting attacked in harbour. Yeah, there is that long experience from the Anglo-Dutch wars, especially. Clarke. I'm at work when you have your live patrons are on. I can always at least listen, if not watch. As my shift is over soon, I want to thank you for the patron. It's been great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Colin Cameron, seems to be a lesson that needs to be learned at least once a generation from the attack on Medway onwards. Yeah. Well, what did you watching at home? Enjoy, Rick. I hope you do. That's it. But they shot themselves in the foot by letting the UK keep HMS Hood, which makes their entire battleship fleet comparatively obsolete. Yes, but their belief is that's one ship. And there's also the conceit. And this comes from the US Navy in many ways. They remember the US were the ones who insisted that capital ships be counted as one group, not battleships and battle cruisers. The US Navy in many ways doesn't understand the battle cruiser. And they don't understand what it's for. They're obsessed with the battle line, which is it's based on a corrupted reading of Mahan in many ways. But also you can understand it, because for the British, economic warfare is a way to make the enemy's battle line come to you. For the Americans, economic warfare is what you do after you destroy the enemy's battle line. So it depends on how you build you factor in economic warfare into your war fighting. Ryan Cash, what was the battleship ratio after Pearl Harbor? Not nearly as good. Jordan Newman, so Admiral Pye took pointers on intelligence from Charles Willoughby. Admiral Pye is an interesting officer. Admiral Pye, within the space of a couple of days, goes from being one of the most bellicose officers who's under Kimmel's commands to one of the most the Japanese are everywhere, they're coming for me officers. Bill Williams, took us just 2 weeks to get to Pearl Harbor from San Diego, but we were on RIMPAC 86. Took us 2 weeks to get to Pearl Harbor. We were on RIMPAC 86. Yeah, that's going to take you slightly longer. To Pearl Harbor. All right, then. There's an interesting one. If I just quickly look it up, there is actually some planning on that. American Naval Force. Oh, I have it somewhere. I have it in my notes. At 18 knots. It's roughly a week to go from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. Sorry, I said 4 days earlier. Oh, let me just check. Yeah, it's 4.2 days at 30 knots. which you can which rarely happens. If you're doing 18 knots, it's 7 days, and if you're doing it at 10 knots, it's 12.6. Because there's a difference of 3,022 nautical miles. I knew there was a 4 days in there, but I forgot it was the 30 knot day, 30 knot one. So if you're managing to go at full speed for the entire 3,000 odd nautical miles, you can get there in 4 days. But if you can't do that, you're not going to. Mitch notes, Pearl Harbor versus current events. I'm having a remarkable sense of deja vu this entire live stream. We all have been. Newest name of Pearl Harbor was still far bigger than the IJN. A slight edge in battleships, but it couldn't all be in the Pacific, and a lot of it was World War I, 4 Pipers. There were issues after Pearl Harbor. The IJN is still smaller, but they have enough resources. Dr. Clarke, the book you recommended, The War at Sea, Naval Atlas, 1939-45, is coming in very handy. Ah, yes, that is the Joyous One by Marcus Faulkner. It really is a good book. He's an excellent historian. George Newman, Willoughby is MacArthur's intel officer who, in 1950, said North Koreans will not attack just a few days before the start of the Korean War. Yeah, that sounds about right. Tim Richards, if they had Wasp at Pearl, could her aircraft be used for recon? Or bad idea? Bad idea. Keep Wasp away from Pearl. Keep everything you can away from Pearl, which was basically, if we go back here to at the beginning, this point from as pointed out by Halsey, and I think it's this page. Kimmel conferred frequently. It was task force. No. Where's his task force conductor? He does have the line. There you go. He did not have enough planes to maintain complete coverage of a 60-degree sector, let alone the 361. This is, of course, from Halsey. And he also organised his fleet into 3 task forces. Where is it? There. I know it's in one of these slides. But basically, Kimmel managed to organise his fleet into 3 task forces, and he always kept 2 of them at sea. The battleships were 1 task force, the carriers were divided into 2 task forces. They were kept as much at sea as physically possible. Basically, Kimmel does everything he can. There isn't much more he could have done to do this, to prepare. And that's really what Kimmel can do. Kimmel can not do as much as we would like to imagine he can as the commander-in-chief. He can only do what he can do, what he can within the resources and the information he's given. And he does quite well with that. Honestly, and here's the other thing I want to point out. Kimmel did not fall apart. He wasn't like MacArthur. He didn't go to a hotel room. For those 10 days, he was still in command of Pearl Harbor. He barely slept. He kept on working. He was getting his fleet back together. He was organizing operations. He was commanding everything. He was working. He was reacting as a good admiral should. He started off all the work which would lead to recovery of the battleships. He started all the work which would lead to many of the operations which Nimitz would put in place. As said, he tried to send a far larger force to Wake Island because he thought that would be the next point which was targeted. And A, his force was delayed in sending, and B, the force that was eventually sent was far too small, and of course Pi cancelled it. And most of the reasons it seems to be delayed and far smaller is because of Pi and similar admirals like him worrying about the Japanese being everywhere and being scared about sending stuff. Dunragam, I assume your engineers would love to see you after such a trip. To be fair, several town-class cruisers had that experience with fast liners doing pretty much 30 knots across the Atlantic and back. They didn't like it. It was a good way to wear out engines. Take care, Sage. Nostradamus, Paul Kimmel. His first name is Husband, and he gets scapegoated for the worst disaster for years since the revolution. Yeah. That's good. He was trying to get this down to get the slugmen out of battleships too. Yes. Which is why another reason why this is going to sound strange. After those initial operations were done, after he'd finished trying to get men out of the battleships alive, etc., and those sort of things, possibly an officer like Kimmel might have resigned to go, I must now go and face the music, and I must resign to someone to replace him. But no. And he certainly wouldn't have left post until, it's going to sound strange, someone like Nimitz was appointed to succeed him. And was there. He wouldn't have trusted it in the officer who he left it with. And just for anyone to know, Pi's actual wartime contribution in terms of an active commander on this, he graduated, is he's altered the sea off the coast of off the west coast of the United States with all the battleships he has under his command in case the Japanese are going to do a raid on the west coast of America. Fine. Any final questions? Because we are coming up to the 3-hour mark, and usually this is the point at which I go, I hope you enjoyed this evening. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. As I said, there's a long patrol coming on Saturday. It's going to be fun. And in much sort of vaulted on Monday, there is going to be a bit of a break from the usual UAD videos, in that I'm going to do a sort of Washington Treaty video. Now, it's going to go through things, but it should be working. It should be good. It should be a lot of fun. But it's been working out exactly what would have been an equitable treaty based on the stats, which has been an interesting one. And whether that would have led to peace is a completely different matter. But I've managed to do that. I think I've managed to come up with something which is, broadly speaking, equitable. Should be interesting, though. Now, Tyrone, are you surprised that the RN, if the correct weight is used and if all the 13.5 ships go, they have 210,368 tons to play with? Not particularly, but there again, I have the RN Excel spreadsheet in front of me based on the official figures they're working off. And that's what I'm going by, the official figures. It's an interesting time if you sort of start looking at the various options of what happens and what could happen. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Patron. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan Barrow. Thank you, Chris. I don't know if you think you answered. Who do you think was the best film, Kimmel? I haven't answered that because honestly, I'm not really sure there's been a good one. The old Pearl Harbor video, movie, the really old one, is probably the one I would give the most credit to. But I think honestly, they haven't really portrayed the man as he was. He's no shrinking violet, and he's not at fault. He did his best. Now, Tim, are you surprised? Well, I've answered that one. Tim Lerman, thank you. Thank you for saying thank you. Cameron, thank you. Colin Cameron, I will ask the nasty one. Which of the more modern Pearl Harbor films is the most accurate? I'm not going into that. Honestly, I don't like any of them. Don't get me started on Midway. It's just not fun. Watching me and having the discussion of the Midway movie is not a fun thing. If you wanted to see a lot of sarcasm, you would put me and Drac together in front of Midway and tell us to record it. There would probably be a small explosion, and there would be a huge amount of iron brew consumed. It's interesting when you start to work out what exactly you can do. Right. Thank you, Stafford. Thank you, Jonathan. Kimmel did his best with what he had to work with then. Yes. Which is a fair assessment of him, I feel. He definitely did work as hard as he could work. No. Putting me, Drac, and Dan in front of Midway from the safety of Canada would be scary for everyone. Six Nelsons would be sugar for everyone. Under my strategy, the Royal Navy, under my treaty, it's let's put it this way. As I've said, the treaty has a different limit. So take care, everyone. Thank you, and most blame falls also on General Washington for lack of resources. True. Right. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. And I'm now going to go and disappear into the world of beautiful spreadsheets for naval history. What have we got coming up? Before I go, let's just quickly talk about these. We have got La Argentina class. We have got La Argentina on Tuesday, which is going to be cool. I haven't done a South American cruiser yet in the year of the cruiser. And we've got coming up this week on Thursday, Patron 50, 1939 Destroyer Doctrine of all the combatant navies. Where did it come from? Which is going to be an interesting one. I have to admit, some of the doctrine I'm going to be talking about is literally my summations based on the ships they built, because the actual documents don't exist. So I'm having to do a sort of forensic engineering approach and forensic engineering analysis approach to working out their doctrine by reverse engineering back from their ships and going, well, this is their doctrine based upon the ships they're actually building, and hoping it's right. All right, take care, everyone. Thank you for watching, and as I said, hope you enjoyed. Thank you, George Newman. Thank you, Stafford Thompson. Thank you, Deb Squad. Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, Sean, Dan, and Stafford, for your very nice role adminning this evening and checking the chat, moderating. Thank you, Strider, Greg, Christopher Ryan, everyone else, Dirt Squad, and Roland Cash, and DG40, Night 6831. Thank you, Phil Williams. Thank you, Colin Cameron. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Stephen Richards. Thank you, everyone, basically. Dirt Squad, all the lovely questions I've had. Thank you, George Newman. Everyone, it's been really nice. And thank you, Colin Cameron. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Take care, and hope you had fun. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Hope you had fun. And as I said, long patrol for this comes out on Saturday. Take care. Bye.